You are listening to the Antler&FeatherCo Podcast. Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to another Antler&FeatherCo Podcast, the podcast for new and adult onset hunters. As you guys know, this is a podcast where me, Vince, an inexperienced newer hunter, brings people onto the show that know a thing or two about hunting. And as I learn things from them, I just want to pass them right along to you guys. So, guys, we've had a handful of shows about arrows recently, but I could not be more excited about our show today. You've heard a lot of talk referencing Dr. Ashby, the Ashby reports. You've heard of the different ways Dr. Ashby has influenced the hunting community. And today, we get to talk to the man himself, Dr. Ed Ashby. Whether you shoot heavy arrows or not, there's a lot to be learned from the work that Dr. Ashby has done over the years. In our last show with Rob and Rob from the Ashby Bowhunting Foundation, we talked about arrow lethality, but we didn't really get too far into the actual 12 arrow penetration factors. So today we're going to focus on that so we can have a better understanding of each one of those factors and how they impact our arrow lethality. Before we get too carried away with the show, I want to take a second to remind you guys, check out Buzzard Roost saddles. They're the most comfortable, most adjustable saddles on the market. I love mine. I don't sell you guys crap that I don't use and don't believe in. And that's really all you need to know. They're awesome. Use code AAFP10 to get yourself 10% off your very own saddle. All right, guys, let's get the show rolling. Joining us today alongside Dr. Ashby is Rob Hummel and Alex Bucan from the Ashby Bowhunting Foundation. So how are you guys doing today? Great to finally talk to you guys and link up.
It's always good when it's hunting season.
Oh, yeah.
Good.
Yeah, I know you had mentioned possibly having to leave early because you had a target buck possibly coming around.
Yeah, I did not see him yesterday, so.
Oh, that's the worst part about them. It's whenever you're not there, they show up.
I know.
I had my buddy last week. He was like, we had a cold front come in and it was Friday, Saturday. And he's like, I'm not hunting Friday. I'm going to get him on Saturday. Sure enough, he shows up right in front of his stand Friday, like 6 p.m. He goes out Saturday, nowhere to be found. Hasn't seen him since.
That's always how it works.
Man. Well, hey, Dr. Ashby, first and foremost, I want to thank you for all the work you've done over the years. Your contributions to the bow hunting community are many. And I know I'm very thankful for everything you've done. Today, I kind of just want to cover the 12 factors one by one so that everyone can have a better understanding of what each factor means and how to apply them to our own arrow builds. Basically, I have the 12 factors written down here, and I'm just going to kind of turn it loose to you to explain those 12 factors. Before we get into that, Alex, I wanted to ask you, you're kind of new on the team from my understanding. So what are you doing with the foundation and what's your role there?
I'm an ambassador, but I call myself a super ambassador because I do quite a bit of work for them in the background, things that the directors kind of just pass off to me because they're busy. They don't have, they're all work and they do this all in their, spare time. So I recently started running the ABF Instagram page to get more on there to, more interaction. And everything I do is just to spread the word. I call it the Ashby gospel.
There you go.
So pretty much I was just working in the background, trying to educate as many people as I can with the reports and the factors and, just pique people's interest to get them to start looking into it.
Yeah. In today's day and age, it's almost, it's essential to have a social media presence. Even I'm not the biggest social media person. I don't like it. I don't like what it's done to our culture in a lot of ways, but it's like, I'm also trying to run this thing here and it's absolutely essential. So it's like, you have to, so have fun with it. It can have its days, but it is a fun thing to do. And, you get to be creative, and with you guys, you're spreading such an important message. It really is an important thing for bow hunting. So thanks for stepping up and doing that, and good luck with all that. I'm sure it's going to be great. So I'm going to say a quick prayer and then we'll hop into the 12 factors if you guys are all good with that.
Sounds good.
All right. So normally, guys, I would do a prayer, but at church today, I had one of the songs had something in it that I really wanted to read out. I really liked it. So O Lord, my rock and my redeemer, gracious savior of my ruined life, my guilt and cross laid on your shoulders. In my place, you suffered blood and died. You rose, the grave and death are conquered. You broke my bonds of sin and shame. Again, you rose, and the grave and death are conquered. You broke my bonds of sin and shame. And Lord Jesus, I can't even begin to humanly express just the thanks. There's absolutely no way we deserve what you did for us. There's no way I should have the freedom to pray to you right now. There's what selfless, completely selfless. And I'm just so thankful and grateful. I hope to glorify you with this podcast first and foremost. And everything that comes beyond or behind that is just, extra. So I'm thankful for Dr. Ashby. I'm thankful for Rob and Alex. It's awesome that they would come on here and talk to me today, and just kind of, it's just wonderful that we get to enjoy this thing that we all love so much, and that they're so willing to share everything that they know. And we ask that you be over this conversation, that you would help it reach as many people as you can. And I'm just so thankful. And we ask all this in Jesus' great name. Amen. All right. So you guys, just to kind of catch up, Rob was on the podcast a few weeks back. So you guys already know Rob's background. You just heard from Alex. We also obviously have Dr. Ashby. And Dr. Ashby, do you want to kind of just, I know everybody already knows you. Everybody's heard anytime arrows get brought up, your name's brought up. But just kind of give a little background of who you are. I'm curious, before we get into the 12 factors, why did you even start this in the first place?
Well, I had bow hunted probably 25 years, and all the traditional bows. And I decided, okay, it's time to catch up with the modern world. So I read up on all the magazines and this and that and the other. Ended up getting a compound. It was a dart, 60 pounds, if I remember right. And, I bought into everything the magazines were saying. So, okay, I got, of course, mechanicals didn't exist then, but I got some multi-blade, replaceable blade type heads, like eras and everything they were talking about. And I was in Minnesota at the time, working on the Indian reservation up there. And that year, I hit and failed to recover 4 deer. I had never done that. I had never shot a deer that I didn't at least get an exit wound on. And I didn't have exits on any of those 4. And I said, well, something's wrong. Now, I come from a rifle shooting background. Dad was an NR rifle instructor. And I started shooting my first competition when I was 5 years old.
Wow.
And, ballistics and all these things were common topics at home. And I was used to being able to, if I want to know something, go to the research. I figured, okay, I'll find some research on terminal performance of arrows. What's not working? And I was looking for something like Hatcher's work or Chamberlain's work with rifles. And there was nothing. Not a word. Absolutely nothing. So I decided, well, I'm going to have to research this some of my own just to find out, what the heck's going on and what's what will give me some better term performance out there. And so I started keeping records. That was about 82. And then fate sort of stepped in because I had requested from South Africa if there was any chance of hunting a rhino with bow and arrow. And this was about 5 years early. And of course, the answer came back, no, bow hunting's not illegal in South Africa. And so I kind of forgot about it. And the Natal Parks Board decided they wanted to look at bow hunting as a possibility. They wanted to research it first, get some hard data, and see how feasible it was. And so they were discussing this, as they tell me, they had a meeting, and somebody there at the table, and I think it was Spud Letton, but I'm not sure about that, said, somebody wrote me about wanting to hunt a rhino with a bow and arrow 4 or 5 years ago. And I may still have this letter. So they went and dug into files and sure enough found it. And they called on the phone and asked if I was still interested in doing that. And it didn't take me. The words went out of their mouth before I said yes. And so I went over to do this rhino hunt. Well, I didn't know at the time this was part of this research project. And when I got over there and was doing the hunt, we talked a lot about archery and so forth. And they asked me if I'd like to come back the next year and do another rhino and be sure it wasn't a fluke. And they were going to do some research in Bucan Park in Natal. Every year they have to call off several thousand animals just to keep the number of animals within the bearing capacity of the park. And could I, bring over as much equipment as I could bring over, different arrow setups and different broadheads. They wanted to look at how effective it was, the different types of equipment, different types of arrows. And so naturally, I was more than happy to do that. And so I went back over, we did the rhino, then we went down to Bucan for a month. And basically, we were set up there. We were live shooting animals. And we were backed up with a rifle. So that if the shot didn't look like it was going to be a lethal hit, or if there was any question, then they would put the animal down with the rifle with a shot somewhere remote from where the arrow was. And then we would look at what happened. And they wanted the shots taken anytime we thought we could make a shot. So they were interested in what happens with bad hits. Hits from all sorts of angles. So we were taking shots that normally a bow hunter wouldn't take. And when we dissected the animals, we keep careful notes. If we could not determine in the field, whether it would have been a lethal hit or not, they had veterinarians on the staff, and they could take it in. They would dissect it and give us an exact determination. Was that lethal hit or would it not have been? And that got me started. At the end of it, I wrote up my report, sent it in as part of the Natal Study. But I had more questions than I had answers at the end of it. So I decided, okay, just for my own knowledge, I'll keep going. And it just grew and grew and grew. And I got more and more information. And finally, I decided, what I'm finding needs to be available to the hunting public. So started trying to get stuff published and did get a lot published all around the world, but couldn't get anything published here. And some of the magazines would give me the excuse that, well, these are African animals. That's not African North American hunting. But a few were pretty honest and said, some of our advertisers' products are not reflected favorably in what's right now. So we can't publish that. And I did get some encouragement from some well-known writers, archery, bowhunting writers, privately. but that it needed to be, keep after the information needed to be collected, and eventually we get stuff published. And they were right. Eventually we did, but it took a long time.
How long ago was this that you're talking about? Like, you tend to think of the marketing game for arrows today as being a fairly recent thing.
Been,
but how?
85.
So this started a long time ago with the arrow thing.
Yeah. So it's been going for a long time. And excuse my cracking voice, but I have a lot of problems with sinuses out here.
You're all good.
Feeder dust everywhere.
Yeah.
But anyway, as I built more and more and more data, every time I would do a series of tests, which were all carefully planned out ahead of time, I would end up with a whole bunch of new questions. And I never got to the end of all of it, which is why we have a foundation. Try to keep going to find some more of these answers. But when I retired in '94, I just liquidated everything in the States, moved to Africa, and just essentially testing full time. And after I was in Africa, things fell apart over there. That's a long story itself. I came back to the States, kind of reorganized. Then I went down to Australia. Was in Australia, New Zealand, New Guinea, that part of the world down there, because the Australians turned out offered a lot of the Asian buffalo that I continued testing on. And the buffalo is the perfect test animal for heavy bone, which is one of the things that most ribs overlap, and they're about bulls will be a little over 0.8 of an inch thick rib. So you can hit a bone on every shot. And it's a bone that, the rib bone on a buffalo, very comparable to hitting the leg bone of a whitetail or an animal of that size, as far as the density, thickness and density of the bone. So it was just an ideal test. But basically, that's where we got started with it. And, it just mushroomed all the way up till I broke my back in 2008. And then it couldn't do anymore. And then in 2017, group of us got together and we formed a foundation and to carry on with the research. But that's basically where the research came from, what got me started on the study.
Well, and that's why, I think it's so important to have you guys on shows like this and, bringing Alex on for social media presence and things like that. This is extremely, if you actually love bow hunting, I think you've got a couple different types of hunters. I think you got guys that you've got your gun hunters, you've got your casual hunters, but there's a big amount of us that love bow hunting beyond just a surface level. And the work that the foundation's doing, it needs to keep going. It needs to get in front of more people because, you talk to people who like to shoot light and fast. And I originally wanted to do here's the case for heavier arrows. Here's the case for light arrows. I can't find anybody with any scientific data to back up the light and fast arrows. Well, I mean, you've got a lot of opinion, but you don't have people running tests as to why should I shoot a 415 grain arrow? Why would that be sufficient? It's because it's fast. What else?
Because it works for me.
That's what you
it works
get.
Until it doesn't.
Yeah. You get a lot of, if you just focus on shot placement, which we talked about that before, like you guys said, I think you said, shot placement's fine, but the animal gets a vote. And so I really appreciate what you have done, Dr. Ashby, and what the foundation continues to do, which is why I'm more than happy to bring you guys in, because once you look at the data that you guys have collected and the results that you've come up with, it's really hard to walk away from it and be like, nah, No, that's a load. That's a load of crap. I appreciate that background because I didn't know any of that. And a lot of people, you cut right into like talking about arrows. So it's cool to know like how it all came to be to begin with. So with that, why don't we just cut into the 12 factors? I'm going to kind of just let you and Rob take that over. We can just start. Like I said, I've got them in front of me here. So we'll start number 1, structural integrity. And whoever wants to take that, go for it.
But before we jump into those, a few things about the factors. The factors came out as a culmination of analyzing the data from 27 years of the data we have. And it's several thousands of shots. On every shot, back then, I was collecting 119 data points off of each shot. Now, with the newer equipment and newer things that are available now, the data we're collecting for foundation, we're collecting just over 250 data points off every shot. So this stuff comes out of the analysis of a tremendous amount of data. And what we tried to do was rate the factors in order of importance when you take all shots into consideration. But you have to realize that the factors can shift under certain conditions. So that when you hit a heavy bone, the top 4 factors, when you look at it overall, you have structural integrity, quality of arrow flight, the FOC of the arrow, and the mechanical advantage of the broadhead. But when a heavy bone enters the picture, 1 and 2 never change. They are always there. So structural integrity and perfect arrow flight are always there. When that heavy bone is hit, the 3rd factor becomes arrow mass above the heavy bone threshold, which taken overall is the number 12 factor. And the other one is the type of edge belt. When a heavy bone is in beyond, it becomes number 4. So the ratings, you have to look at them as, okay, this is overall. But you have to realize certain types of hit, certain individual factors become more important. Now, take it individually. Each and every factor boosts your arrow's penetration potential. So if you omit or diminish any of the factors, it reduces your arrow penetration, at least in some conditions. Now, it's impossible to anticipate ahead of time what each hit's going to be. So it's impossible to know beforehand which penetration factors become most important. So maximizing your successful hits, wounding and losing or wounding and not recovering animals requires incorporation of as many of the penetration enhancing factors as you can.
Yeah.
And the other thing to realize is the factors compound each other. So that if you have 10 inches of penetration and one individual factor gives you a 20% increase, well, that's going to give you 2 more inches or 12 inches of penetration. Then if you introduce a second factor that gives you a 20% increase, well, that second 20% increase is going to give you 2.4 inches of penetration gain instead of just the 2 inch. And so it goes with each factor so that they build upon each other. And the thing about the factors is the bow hunter needs to look at this as a toolbox. Nobody's telling you he's got to use them all, but they're all there. He can pick and choose and pull out the factors he wants to use. Any factor you add in is going to improve the terminal performance of your arrows. And things that you leave out are not going to change the setup that you got. It's not going to add anything. Now, let's get into the factors. So, like I said, the first one is the structural integrity. And it is the most important factor. And it applies to every aspect of your arrow. In the data, even a tiny bend at the tip of an arrow, one so small that you almost have to feel with your thumbnail, average of penetration loss of 14%.
Wow.
Now, just as for having a sharp broadhead, structural integrity should be a given requirement for every hunting arrow. Now, with our new study, we've developed a way to rate. We've got a rating system. And a failure of structural integrity of significant amount gives an automatic F for that broadhead, that arrow setup. So your structural integrity is an absolute must-have arrow design feature. And without it, no other factor can be relied upon. Rob, Alex, you got anything you want to add there?
No, I mean, like you said, it's really the foundation of the entire system, right? No different than a house. If the foundation isn't solid, it doesn't matter what the rest of the print looks like. You could have the most mass, great FOC, everything else. But if that core element isn't there, it's going to fail. And it might be, a failure like Doc mentioned of, a small tip curl that causes it to deviate off path, and now you didn't hit what you think you hit. Or it could be complete failure where I don't think people recognize how significant the leverage aspect is for the broadhead against the rest of the system. So if the broadhead starts bending or starts failing where it's getting out of line with the rest of the shaft, one, there's going to be a significant increase in resistance, but all of that resistance is going to be acting off of the natural line and then compounding with whatever the lever point is. And that's where you see all the failures in the shafts, because something got off. Now it's pushing at a different angle, and shafts aren't really intended to take side load, right? They're great at frontal. They're not very good at side loads.
Right. And
so that's where it's the, that solid foundation that lets everything else work.
That's, it's funny because that's one of the, like I think we talked about before, the quality of the material, whatever the material ends up being that a lot of people's broadheads are made of, the quality of the steel isn't there. And the thickness of some of these mechanical blades, and not even mechanical, I mean, you see it on fixed blades too, they're so thin. But it's not something people even think or care about a lot of times.
Another thing with broadheads is the sharpness. A lot of people think that they buy a new pack of broadheads, mechanicals or fixed, and that out of the package, they are sharp enough. Until I found the factors, I never thought about broadhead sharpness. Right. I just figured, I bought these, they're good to go, throw them on the end of my arrows, and off I went.
Well, the package said razor sharp.
Yeah. But that's actually, I guess, another piece of the structural integrity discussion is the retention, right?
Yeah.
So even if something is extremely sharp, how well does it hold it? How long does it stay sharp? And like for most people, you don't have access to a best tester or, anything else to, quantify that sharpness level. So the easy rule of thumb is if it's not sharp, like shaving sharp or whatever, your gauge is after the animal, then it's a question mark. You don't know when it dulled out. It could have dulled out right after entering the thoracic cavity. It might have dulled out after exiting the backside. You don't know. And the only way, to guarantee that it was cutting cleanly the entire way is if it's still sharp afterwards.
Yeah.
Oh, excellent points. Okay, we're ready for perfect arrow flight. That's the second factor. Now, perfect arrow flight means an extremely well-tuned arrow. And perfect arrow flight is the enabler for every other factor. When that arrow is flying perfect, it delivers more usable force on the target. Less of the arrow's force has been used up in unstable arrow flight. So arrow flight permits the additional factors to work at the full efficiency of what their potential is. Poor arrow flight just squanders your arrow force. And you should never spare any effort or any expense to achieve absolutely perfect arrow flight, regardless of what kind of arrow you shoot. Now, these first two factors apply to everything. And really, a bow hunter should not be hunting with an arrow that doesn't meet at least these two first factors. And you can make every arrow meet these requirements as long as that arrow spine, dynamic spine, is balanced to the arrow setup you have and the bow you're using. Now, even if you have every other factor in place, without a good arrow flight, you're still going to have poor terminal arrow performance. However, if you ignore those other design features, all you're going to end up with is a perfect flying arrow that still performs poorly on some hits, which is going to negate your structural integrity and perfect flight advantage. So these factors all build, just like Rob said, perfect analogy, on this foundation of having the structural integrity and perfect arrow flight. Rob, Alex, anything you want to add in here?
No. I guess a couple of things that I would mention. I guess I know you already noted how interconnected a lot of these are. And this is, I guess, a key one, because you could have what should be the toughest system ever. It's footed, it's great materials, covers all the bases. If your arrow isn't flying cleanly, it's significantly more likely to fail. And so on top of the efficiency aspects, if that arrow is coming in and impacting off the direction of movement, if it's at an angle at all compared to its direction, it's an energy dump. You're going to be creating large amounts of flex. You're going to be exacerbating all, the actual penetration direction and angle, because once that broadhead bites in, if everything's off and it starts flexing, guess what? The broadhead is pointing and cutting whatever direction based on that flex. And that's, I mean, you can see it all over the place on, YouTube hunter channels, or even on mainstream, hunting shows, where it'll be a relatively broadside shot, and all of a sudden the arrow exits, behind the ribs on the other side, or comes out the bottom, or whatever. But it wouldn't be doing that if it was hitting clean and holding together. Right. So it's definitely a critical point, not just in the fact that we want the flight clean to be able to hit where we're intending, but it can drastically impact how the system holds together as a whole. And as far as knowing if your flight is clean, I know that I get that question a lot. Not everyone is going to bear shaft.
Right.
But easiest thing is, do your broadheads hit where they're supposed to? Because the majority of people that lean towards like mechanicals are doing it because they hit with their field points.
Right.
And so now they think, oh yeah, like this is better because it's hitting where I want it to. It's only doing that because your flight's not good. And by minimizing the surface area, it's not deviating during that recovery.
Right.
So that's, any fixed blade should hit with field points, right?
Yeah.
And people get technical all the time on this. Yes, there's a different drag. Yes, there's going to be small deviations, but we're talking functionally, even at 60, 70, 80 yards, it'll still hold that pattern. It'll still be hitting where you want.
Yeah.
If it's coming out clean.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to dumb it down even more, like I just have the picture in my head of like when we were kids, and this it's going to kind of touch on the next one as well. But like, you almost instinctively know that when you throw a stick at something, you make your little spear when you're playing Cowboys and Indians or whatever, you instinctively know you want the front end of it to be heavier. And I just imagine, when you're talking perfect arrow flight in terms of, hitting the animal and getting through, if you've ever thrown a stick and it throws sideways, right away, like that's not going to work in your little game you're playing in your head. You want that thing traveling perfectly straight.
Mm-hmm.
And again, to your point, I don't know why that doesn't translate over into bow hunting, because that's something we all did as kids before we didn't know anything about any 12 factors, but that you want that perfect arrow flight. But then when it comes to bow hunting, like you said, I know I've talked to people and I'm like, the broadhead thing comes up and it's like, oh, I shoot fixed. And I'm like, oh, I tried that one time. They were 6 inches off of my field points. But when I put those mechanicals on, they're right there. And it's like, well, why didn't you figure out why they're 6 inches off? Your bow's not like, your bow doesn't just magically change where the rest was and it just shoots them different. Like there's a reason it's shooting off. But
and that's a challenge right now across the industry, at least in the US. Is I don't know how many shops I've been in that have flat out told me that fixed blades don't fly well. And those are the experts. Those are the guys setting up bows and trying to educate people on what they should be using and what they should be trying to achieve.
Right.
So it's hard to blame the general, hunting public when they're not the experts. They're going to whoever they feel is knowledgeable and being told this information.
Yeah.
I'm just going to flat out say it. A pro shop is not like professional. It's promotional. They're pushing and selling what the mainstream hunting industry is pushing and selling, which is speed and mechanicals. Doc mentioned earlier before we started, how I found the factors. I started bow hunting when I was 13. So this is my 18th season. I've taken a lot of deer with my bow, but 5 years ago now, I think it's
5 or 6.
I shot a doe and I'm sitting there looking at my arrow, sticking straight up and down out of the ground, going, what just happened?
Yeah.
Why is my arrow sticking straight up and down in the ground? I knew I hit her. I knew how she took off. What is this? And the only thing I can come up with is it went in, deflected off a rib, and shot out the bottom of her cavity. A rib, a whitetail rib, should not stop an arrow. That's just not acceptable. So same season, I shot a buck. And I have always had this irrational fear in my head of the front shoulder because several years prior to that, I hit a big buck in the shoulder and I achieved minimal penetration. I mean, maybe 2 inches. The broadhead snapped off in the shoulder. So I hit him a little further back this one because I was subconsciously just afraid of hitting that shoulder. And now, mind you, the first few deer I have ever taken, I took with a fixed head, either thunderhead or muzzy. I didn't have penetration issues. I had pass-throughs. Then all of a sudden my dad and my brother switched to shooting rages. And I'm like, well, if you're switching to rages, then I am too, because why not? That's what the mainstream industry is shooting. That's what everyone's shooting. You're shooting it. I can too.
Right.
So that's when I switched. And then, that doe sticking straight up and down on the ground. Obviously it deflected off something. So structural integrity, arrow flight, I'm sure I had a mix of everything going wrong there to cause these failures. Well, then I shot this buck and hit him a little bit back. It was still lethal, but I wasn't comfortable going for him that night. So we went to go look for him the next day. And I felt like crap. I mean, anybody that does not expire their animal right away or recovers it, I mean, it's a bad feeling. You never want to go home and have to try and sleep wondering if you just wounded an animal.
Right.
So we ended up finding that deer. But I'm like, man, something isn't right. These deer deserve better. They're not expiring as fast as I want them to. I want these complete pass-throughs. Why am I not getting them? So I ended up stopping at a local tavern and grabbing a bite to eat after hunting one night. And there was 2 guys just a couple stools down from me that were talking. Yes, I was eavesdropping. Okay. They were talking about, back in the day when they started hunting. So this would be around, 85 or whatever, how they'd shoot and they could go get a cup of coffee and still come back to watch the arrow make point of impact because it was so slow, but they still, they always got pass-throughs. So I went home and I was like, all right, what was different then versus now? Aluminum arrows. So they're naturally heavier compared to, the carbon. And everyone shot fixed heads, really. Thunderheads were pretty big. And that's about 125 grain head usually. So, heavier shaft, heavier arrow, fixed head at 125 grains. So a little bit higher FOC. All right. So my brain starts thinking here, what can I do to change what I'm shooting here? Which was either Rages or Grim Reapers on the end of Carbon Express. I mean, I think my initial arrow build weighed a total of high 300s.
Yeah, it was
and it was 11% FOC. Looking back now, I didn't know any better, but I'm disgusted that I was hunting with that. Cause to me, that's personally for myself, that's not ethical. And the whole, I want to be as ethical and lethal as possible. the game that I'm pursuing deserves that. They deserve to die as quickly and as relatively painless as possible.
Right.
So that's how I found this eventually, I guess. I plugged it into Google, random words, trying to find something that made sense. Right. And I mean, now you would find the Ashby reports likely. At the time, I was struggling finding anything. They weren't super well out there yet at the time. I kept finding stuff about kinetic energy. But then I was in a group, random group, Wisconsin bowhunting group, and trying to talk about this stuff with people. And someone found me and ended up bringing me back to this person here. Mm-hmm. And I mean, that's really all she wrote. So like these factors, like I found these factors and like they've touched on it several times now. Like a lot of people like to think, well, the ABF says you have to do this. You have to shoot a 650 grain arrow. Like not at all. Like Doc will say it. Doc will back me up on this. Like you shoot as heavy as you can. That gives you a trajectory that you're still comfortable with, that you can live with. And you implement as many of the factors from the 12 penetration factor list as you can to your build based on the terrain you're hunting, the animal you're pursuing, your, lethal distance that you're comfortable shooting. But at the end of the day, the first two factors are like, the foundation of your build.
Right.
And ever since I've changed, I went from that arrow build to a 525 grain build with mid-20s FOC, shooting a 200 grain Maasai up front. Now, if I was shooting 42 pounds at the time with a 24-inch draw length, and I can get my 200 grain, like big broadhead to hit with my field points, I think anyone can.
Yeah. Yeah.
But ever since I've switched, every deer that I have shot, I have watched die within eyesight in seconds.
Yeah.
Like, it's just insane to me that I went from having to leave deer lay overnight because I wasn't sure if they were expired yet or I was going to jump them, to watching them die like seconds after point of impact is made. So like these factors are crucial, and the people that don't want to hear it are the people that have the mainstream hunting industry just have a hold on.
Well, and they're still in that phase where you were, where you had success.
Right. It was working.
And for a lot of people, that's what it is if it's working, it's tough to change.
Yeah.
But now, like Vincent said earlier, there's people that like to bow hunt, and then there's people that it's more to them. And that's where I am. My whole life revolves around archery and bow hunting. And if I couldn't be as lethal and ethical as possible in that woods, I would walk away, because that's what the animals deserve. If I'm not giving them my best, whether it's on me and I need to practice more or I need to change my equipment, whatever, if I'm not willing to do that, I don't deserve to be in that woods.
But, and that's where you were at when you came into the shop and first started asking questions on this, was like, if something doesn't change, then like I'm going to be done.
Yeah.
Because this isn't, what's happening isn't acceptable.
And
right.
Like anybody that knows me, like that would kill me. Like bow hunting is literally my life, but I was willing to hang it up if I couldn't fix what was wrong, to be more lethal and ethical in the woods, because that's what they deserve. And I think everybody needs to get their mindset a little bit right on that.
Yeah. And I wonder how, a lot of times I think when someone does have we'll just call it like a oops moment with, it's the failure. I think that's one thing, like you hear, well, maybe one time, well, I guess to speak to failures, I think sometimes people's arrow failures, they don't realize that it's a failure. They go out, they shoot, like you said, they go find their arrow. It's sticking straight out of the ground. Awesome. It was easy to find. It's but they don't think about why. But I feel like for a lot of the hunting community, it's acceptable to, well, let's let it lay for 8 hours. I think it was a liver shot. I think I might have shot back. Let's just let it lay there for 8 hours. And I think that's just become part of hunting. Like, you see these charts of like wherever you think your arrow hit is the amount of time that you should give that animal. And like we said, nobody's perfect. Nobody's always just going to blast the heart every single time, watch it die 20 yards away. But I think to your point, you should demand more out of yourself and your system, to where you really shouldn't. I don't know. I don't like the idea of, well, I think I hit back, so we're just going to let it lay there for 12 hours. Like, and I wonder if that just became more acceptable over time. Like if you were to ask our grandparents or whatever back in the day when they were shooting heavier systems, like how often did that happen back then?
Well, that's kind of where I got from listening to those people talk.
Yeah.
Like they always had pass-throughs. They had something to go on. I mean, 2 holes is better than one, and I said I would sometimes subconsciously hit further back, but I mean, I shot a lot of deer in, the lungs and the heart still using mechanicals, but I still never got pass-throughs. And when you're sitting 24 feet up a tree and, it's like a 24-yard shot, that, what am I looking for here?
Angle?
The angle is so steep that the one buck I shot was a 13-pointer. It was a perfect shot, but the angle was so steep and I didn't have the juice to penetrate through the other side for a pass through, and it stayed in there and we couldn't find a drop. There was not a drop of blood. And I mean, it took us forever to find that deer.
Well, and to your point, Vincent, this has been a long process to get to where we are. Right. And it's self-feeding, because as things got lighter, as broadheads kept getting wider, as the blades got thinner and weaker, everyone slowly but surely started promoting further back. The shoulder blade is impossible now, and you need to aim back here. And then what happens if you're aiming back and now you do have an oops? Now where are you?
Yeah.
Right. And honestly, that's one of the biggest things with folks that I've worked with, is getting them into a system that actually is following the factors, but then having to recondition how they shoot. Yeah. And going, no, like, be confident, like what we've put together and what you have covered in the factors, you should be confident putting that arrow where it needs to go.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, everything starts dropping over, right? Because now you're aiming up in the front of the chest. You're aiming where all of the blood vessels and the arteries are the most densely packed and the largest.
Yeah.
The further back you get, everything starts spreading out and thinning. And so it's kind of just full circle, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's kind of funny because it's almost like it's like from start to heavy fixed blade, time goes on, light mechanical. As you mentioned, shot placements moved back. It's nowadays, a lot of people would tell you, even if you have a quote unquote plan B arrow for that shoulder, if you're even considering shooting the shoulder, that's unethical.
Well, and that's where, I mean, everyone says the shoulder, but there is so much real estate there.
Yeah.
That, I mean, I don't know how many people I've spoke with that don't even like recognize that you have, where the leg comes up, comes forward, and then the shoulder blade comes back. There's an entire pocket there that is nothing but meat.
And see, when I first started, I thought, before I looked into anatomy, I just assumed that was all bone. Like that that magic triangle, where the bone structure.
Uh-huh.
I just assumed that was shoulder blade. So don't shoot there. And it's like, no, it's actually like it's exactly where you need to go on a perfect scenario.
Yeah.
Right.
But
that's, same here. I grew up being told, hit them behind the front shoulder. Well, behind the front shoulder, then when you have a whoopsie and you're back too far, you're like, oh, lung, liver, guts. Like, oh, okay.
Yeah. All right. So let's move on to number 3. This is going to be You know, one of the biggest terms that we hear out there in the aero community, FOC. So Doc, you want to take it away with FOC?
Okay, our third factor is extreme FOC. Now, most people don't really understand what FOC is, what we're talking about. It basically means weight forward of center, or what the percentage difference is between the geographical center of the arrow, in other words, half the wing, and the balance point. Now, this is strictly a made-up reference system. It has nothing to do with true FOC. True FOC is an aeronautical term, and it refers to the distance between the center of gravity of a projectile in flight and the center of pressure of a projectile in flight. And that distance can change depending on angle of attack of the wind, all sorts of things. So what we're using is not true FOC. It's a reference point, just like measuring the static spine. The static spine is so we can have a reference point to duplicate an arrow. It has nothing to do with how it's going to shoot off the bow. That's the dynamic spine. So totally different things, but it's a reference point we use for building the arrow. Now, FOC, true FOC of an object in flight has a great bearing on its stability or object moving on the ground as far as that goes. A good example would be something like the F-22 Raptor, which has almost a neutral 0% weight forward of center in flight. That makes it highly maneuverable. It can fly almost sideways. It is so unstable, a human cannot fly it without computer assist. We can't react fast enough to do it. So there is a difference between that and something that has a really high FOC. The higher the FOC, the more stable an object in motion is. In other words, the harder it is to get to deviate off its course. And that's exactly what we want in an arrow. We want stable flight. Now, it's important to remember that an arrow is always flying once it leaves the bow. It flies through the air. It flies through the skin, the fascia, muscles, bone. If it exits, it flies through the air again. When it hits the dirt, it flies through the dirt until it comes to a stop. Then it's no longer flying. So it's always in flight. Another way to think about the effect of FOC is in automobiles. If you have a very neutral or very low FOC, then the car is very maneuverable, but also very sensitive. So you could think about something like the Grand Prix cars that need to be highly maneuverable. As you get this lower FOC, cars will tend to oversteer. So if you make a small correction, it makes a big difference in where the car is aimed. But if you have a car that's very front-headed, it'll go down the highway and you know, on a straight road, you take your hands off the wheel. It'll just cruise right straight on down. But when you start to steer it to go around a curve, it takes more force. Now, people that have grown up with power steering don't realize how much force that is. I grew up when power steering just wasn't the thing you had. And most of the cars were built with big, heavy engines.
Yeah.
Talking about the era where we're starting to get into the V8s, big, heavy engines up front. And it took a lot of arm strength to turn those cars, to get them to deviate. They were very stable. They wanted to keep going straight. this is what we're looking for in an error. So realize the difference between true FOC and what we're measuring. What we're measuring gives us an indication of the type of true FOC you get. But it is not the true FOC. It is the reference point we use to be able to duplicate that when we build another error. Now let's get a little bit into the definitions. Now, I had to make up some of these definitions when I started researching FOC because I had to be able to differentiate between the different groups. So I started out with normal FOC. And that was at or below 12%. And I picked that up from existing charts, Eastern charts, things like that. They considered this normal FOC for an error. And they considered high FOC to be anything above 12%. I think Eastern used to say 12 to 15%. But I put FOC as between 12 and 19%. Now, I use 19% because at 19%, I had the first measurable, definite penetration gain that I could attribute totally to the FOC of the error. And we were doing this with errors that were identical externally. Same shaft diameter, same broadheads, same fletching, everything the same, except for the FOC. And so at 19%, I started seeing penetration gain. As I continued on investigating FOC, I found a need to expand that into starting at 19% and going up to 30%. I call that extreme FOC. And then above 30%, I define as ultra extreme FOC. Now I use 30% because with the components available at the time, it was extremely difficult and really took a concerted effort and sometimes custom built components to reach 30%. Now you can do that quite easily. There's a lot more components available, a lot better shafting, wider shafting available of the stiffen up. So 30% is fairly achievable for most people, unless you're a gorilla and shooting 32, 33, 34 inch arrows. Then it becomes more difficult, but still doable. But you end up with an awfully heavy arrow. So when we got to testing extreme FOC, and initially I thought FOC was not going to be a big factor, which shows you how wrong you can be when you just assume something. Extreme FOC does more than any other defined features except flight quality to maximize the effect you get from other factors. All of the extreme FOC testing showed very high penetration gains, and they are progressively cumulative gains. So if the gain you get from 19 to 20% is not as great as the percentage gain you get from 20 to 21, and so forth on up. Every increase you make gives you a higher percentage gain in the penetration you had at that next lowest percentile level. So it really adds up. And it's amazing. It seems to be right around 26% that it really starts making big gains with each 1% increase. And we can quantify it to a degree. We still need a lot more data to pin it down exactly. But the penetration gains you can get in extreme FOC can range anywhere from 40 to 60% compared to an arrow that has 12% FOC. So it's a significant gain in penetration. Anybody want to add anything there?
I was just going to say FOC is the most important when you have impact on something hard, correct?
Well, no, it actually has no effect on the heavy bone threshold, which we'll get to after a while and why.
But the post-breach.
But the big difference it makes is once you reach the bone,
yes,
it has a huge effect.
Because it keeps the arrow on its intended path. Correct. Yeah.
But up till you breach the bone, it really doesn't make any difference in being able to get through the bone.
Yeah.
Once through the bone, it's one of the biggest factors you can have. For one thing, you've got that stable flight, which means it wants to keep going straight. It doesn't want to deviate or veer, which is going to pull that shaft straight through the hole, through the bone that's been created where you breach the bone.
Yeah, and that's one thing to kind of wrap your head around is an arrow is always flying, whether it's flying through the air, flying through muscle, flying through bone, it's flying. And so that stability is across all of that, right? And so again, this is where everything kind of feeds. So if you have higher FOC, it's going to be easier because of that stability to have your perfect flight. Right. If you have higher FOC, now the front of your shaft is acting stiffer because it's a shorter lever, less flex, less leverage applied to the shaft. Now it's more durable, right? And so it compounds and like reinforces the core items that are above it, right? That's the one big thing that some people can get in trouble with is trying to like hit a certain number without thinking about the sacrifices that they're making, right? Especially with like today's shafts, you have some like extremely light options that are on the market, which can be really tempting because if your normal shaft for your spine is say around 9 or 10 grains per inch, and this other one, this ultralight shaft is at 6, that's a lot of FOC that you could get with a very similar build. But at what cost?
Right.
How did, is it a really light shaft because it's using, a new resin, but it's, really durable still? Or is it just a really thin walled shaft? Right. And so you definitely need to make sure that you're keeping the full picture in mind. And I mean, in a lot of cases, I look at FOC as the result of a good build, right? If from a very simple starting out kind of standpoint, if you pick a more durable, heavier broadhead, and then you pick a more durable component, you're going to increase your FOC, even if you don't change anything else.
Right.
Right. And then even without getting crazy, you can switch from vanes to feathers.
Yeah.
And that's going to have significantly more impact on where that balance point is than adding another 25 grains up front.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's where, you want to maximize, but you need to think about how you approach it.
Yeah.
Right. Because it's a lot easier to take weight off the tail. And, 5 grains on the tail can do what 50 grains up front can in, a lot of cases. So as much as they can be nice, veins, if you have 3 blazers, 18 grains. If I put 3, gateway razors, or if I do like Doc's A&A cut, little 2-inch feathers, you're probably looking at 5 to 6 grains total for those feathers, right?
Yeah.
And having a standard knock instead of a lighted knock, that can be 10 grains. Not having a wrap, right? It's all little things, but a lot of times people don't think about it, where like they'll put this great build together and then they'll put 4 veins on the back that each weigh 8 grains. They'll put a 10-inch wrap on it, put a lighted knock on it, and then go, oh man, like I really thought I was going to have more front of center. Like I've got 300 grains up front.
Yeah.
It's like, well, yeah, you would, but you added 25 or 30 grains to the tail.
Well, it's interesting when you kind of brought up how big of a difference, how it, taking a little bit of weight off the back, as opposed to just slamming it all on the front.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you look at, if you were to just ask anybody, myself included, like, does 18 grains on the back end really make that big of a difference? I would tell you no. I mean, it's such a small number in, in comparison to the whole build. When you're talking like, let's just say my arrow this year, 585, yeah, my buddy, you can shoot lighted knocks, and it's like, well, yeah, why not? But you're adding all those, however many more grains. To me, it seems like it wouldn't make any bit of a difference. But turns
and it's
out,
all leverage, right?
Yeah,
it's levers. So if you've got a 30-inch arrow and your balance point bear is at, say, 15 inches. So you're at, 25% forward of the physical center. I guess I said the numbers wrong there, but if it's a 30-inch arrow, you wouldn't be 15. Yeah. But if you were halfway, if you were at the quarter, right, halfway from the end in the physical middle, you'd be at 25%. And now that means that you've got 3/4 of that shaft is the tail.
Yeah.
Right. That's a long lever compared to the quarter of it on the front. And with looking at the leverage, what happens the longer your lever gets, right? If you grab a 6-inch ratchet and then you grab a 3-foot ratchet, big breaker bar, what changes?
Yeah.
You don't need as much effort to get the same results, right? It's the same thing, is putting a bunch of weight on 6-inch section of that shaft is great, but the other end of it is acting on 24 inches.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So moving on to number 4, this is one that, I'm reading over. It makes sense when I read it, but I haven't I haven't personally paid much attention to it, I guess because I just didn't understand it, but mechanical advantage, I'm excited to learn a little bit more about all that. So, Doc, if you want to go ahead and dig in on mechanical advantage.
All right. Before I do that, what Rob was saying brought up another thought that worth passing along, because I really don't think I've put much about it in the reports other than just to mention it. But as I got into using the very, very high, ultra extreme FOC arrows, I was having to use very lightweight, very thin target shafts to be able to get the FOC that I wanted to work with. And something very unusual popped up in the data that as I got up to those higher levels, I think I got up to about 31.5% FOC. The damage rate of the shafts, even though these were light, thin shafts, dropped off to almost nothing. And I think that has to do with two things. One, because you have that very short forward lever arm, the distance from the balance point to the broadhead, there's less flex up front on that shaft. So that it's taking the impact more directly with longitudinal fibers, longitudinal dimension of the shaft. And the rear shaft being a lot lighter, when the broadhead hits something hard and has to slow down, there's less forward push, less forward impulse of force from the shaft pushing forward.
Gotcha.
And it made a significant difference in damage rate of shafts. Now, these are shafts, collars didn't exist then. I did some work with making collars out of aluminum shafts to go over carbon shafts. But these shafts had no reinforcement at all. And yet, in the testing, I damaged zero, none of them. So there may be a structural advantage effect on the shaft by having a very, very lightweight shaft in the back. And, which gives you a higher FOC.
I've seen that same thing, and you got to be up there.
I think it's in the ultra.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where it can be messy, because if, someone that's at, say, 20%, great number, solid build, but you're not potentially going to see those same benefits structurally as someone that's up around 30.
No, I do not see it in the 20% range.
Yeah. And it's actually kind of funny because I think the most common structural failure that I had seen with my 25 to I think the highest that I've ever put together was 32%, is actually the knock.
Yeah, knocks pop off a lot.
It's if there was any deviation or some skip angle exhibited, that tail just becomes a whip, and the back end of it can take some abuse. But definitely a difference there once you get up close to that 30.
All right, so let's dig into mechanical advantage.
Okay, now mechanical advantage is a term from physics applied to a simple machine. And it basically is how much the simple machine can magnify the work that can be done with a given amount of force. So the higher the mechanical advantage of your broadhead, which is just a simple machine of series of inclined planes, that increases the work your arrow does with whatever useful force is available. Now, the degree of gain is going to vary depending on which broadheads you compare. Now, broadhead mechanical advantage has a more pronounced influence on the outcome penetration of a perfectly flying and structurally secure arrow than any other factor except extreme FOC. Higher broadhead mechanical advantage is applicable to all arrows, all designs. It doesn't matter. If you go from the broadhead you're using to a broadhead with a higher mechanical advantage, you are going to get more work, more capacity to do work out of that arrow. And the work we're talking about here is penetration. Now, the more efficient all the rest of your arrow is, the more penetration gain your higher broadhead mechanical advantage is going to give you, because you have conserved arrow force. And that conserved arrow force is going to be multiplied by the mechanical advantage of the broadhead. Now, there are a lot of broadheads out there now, 2-blade broadheads, that have a mechanical advantage right around 1, which means you're gaining nothing.
Mm-hmm.
If the cut is as wide as the broadhead is long, then you've got a mechanical advantage of 1. You're gaining nothing.
Or a 2-blade.
Or 2, yeah.
So the when you're talking broadheads, your mechanical advantage is going to be increased by, would it be like the length of the broadhead and how narrow the broadhead is? So if you're shooting a real wide broadhead, your mechanical advantage decreases?
Yeah.
Okay.
The narrower, the longer, the fewer the blades.
Okay.
If you have a 3-blade broadhead, and each blade is a 1/2 inch high from center line of the broadhead, it's got to be 6 inches long to be a 3-to-1 mechanical advantage. 2-blade broadhead can be 1 inch wide and 3 inches long and give you a 3-to-1 mechanical advantage. So by adding one more blade, you would have to double the length of the broadhead to have the same mechanical advantage.
But with that, I do have a question, and it might be kind of off topic, but I think it's relevant to the times right now. I feel like last year or the year before, when I was getting into wanting to look into the, your reports and build a heavier arrow, it seemed like 2-blade single bevel was the way to go. Now I've seen a shift from some broadhead companies who were real big on 2-blade single bevel to now they are introducing a 3-blade. And it seems like within the world of heavier arrows, a 3-blade's kind of being pushed a little bit. What advantage would a 3-blade have over a 2-blade single bevel? And is it just another magical marketing thing for the times? Or is there a reason that people are starting to say, hey, maybe a 3-blade is, it's still very heavy, but it seems like they're shifting away from the single bevel and going to this 3-blade.
Well, 3-blades have always been popular with people. 3-blade has some drawbacks, though. It is the least efficient broadhead at breaking bone. 4-blade breaks bone better than a 3-blade. Now, on a soft tissue hip, they say, well, you get a bigger cut. But they're also not taking into consideration that single bevel heads are rotating. And a double bevel head, doesn't matter how many blades, all rotation stops when it hits the animal. And you can follow the wound channel through and verify that. There's no doubt about it. But that single bevel continues spiraling. It actually spirals a little faster than it does going through the air because of the pressure differential between the bevel side and the unbeveled side. So it's making a spiral cut. So the path of that broadhead, it's cutting edges. The path that they subscribe, being a spiral, is a longer wound channel than had it went right straight through. And you have some other factors that come into, like starburst cuts we'll talk about those when we talk about age levels.
A big part of it is we're getting more attention on the heavier heads, which is allowing those companies to try and tap into some of the other portions of the market, right? There's guys that are diehard 3-blade, diehard 4-blade, want a really wide cut, and you're not going to produce a product that is just going to sit on the shelf and add costs, and overhead.
Mm-hmm.
So now that more people are looking at heavier heads, companies are doing what companies do and expanding to try and pull in other parts of the market that they previously couldn't touch.
Right.
And this is pure speculation on my part, but I think that has a lot to do also with people needing that blood trail to find their deer. It's a mental game, and you'll see a lot of people on social media talking about single bevels. Well, I shot my deer or my animal, and it only went 50 yards, but there was no blood trail. So that makes people panic. How am I going to find my deer without blood? That's where the art of tracking has been lost. I could talk about that for hours. But also, when your deer dies, in seconds, 30 yards from point of impact is the general rule of when like a trail would about start.
Like 30 to 50.
Yeah. So
like after the initial rush and shock, right? You have the spurts, and then somewhere, 30, 50 yards down the line, you'd have the actual trail.
Start of a blood trail. But if your deer is, dying, within 50 yards of where you shot it or whatever, 100 yards at the most or 100 yards and in, that animal didn't have time to leave a blood trail.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if you're watching your deer die, you don't need that anyways.
Yeah.
So I think people have just really become dependent on having that blood trail. They need that, huge. It's just been so ingrained in their heads. You need that 2-foot wide blood trail. But you don't. You really don't.
And that's the tough part, is that it's not the broadhead for blood trail. It's where that broadhead travels, and where the entrance is, and where the exit is, and the animal's body position at the time that the arrow was passing through.
What kind of cut?
Whether it was, twisted or straight, right? Because you can have phenomenal blood trails with small 2-blades.
Yeah.
And you can have horrendous blood trails with 2-inch wide mechanicals.
Yeah.
Last year, my buddy hit one with a rage. No, not a drop of blood.
And it's one where people put so much stock in the size of the cut or the number of blades, and thinking that it is directly tied to what they see on the ground. But it's just really not the case. And it's that mental aspect of going, oh, I have to have that, and not even, giving it a chance.
Yeah. Well, I've had that with buddies, or, they can't find blood. And where'd you shoot it? Well, I shot it a little high, but I have this huge expanding, razor blade on the front of it. Like, there should be blood. And it's like, well, where was your, is there an exit wound low at all anywhere? Like, I think that, I don't know how the whole idea of, a red carpet blood trail even got tied in with a broadhead in the first place.
Marketing.
Well,
it's
there
how
you
they
go.
sell broadheads.
But yeah.
But I guess on the mechanical advantage topic, I guess to your earlier point, the easiest way to think about it is a ratio. If you look at any head, just mentally compare its overall blade length with the width, right? And that's the longer and narrower that it is, the more efficient it is. It's if you looked at that broadhead like a ramp, like a wheelchair ramp, right? It's a lot easier to push that wheelchair up a gradual slope than to try and go straight up a wall.
Right.
Right. If you think about some of the mechanicals where, even if it's not extremely wide, say you've got two heads that are both like 1.25 inches, and one is mechanical where the blades are very abrupt, right? Like most of them that you look at, they're like airplane wings,
right?
So now if that's your ramp, you're starting at the tip at the ferrule and you've got to get to the top.
Yeah.
Right. So there's a lot more effort to get there. And with our arrows, you have a fixed amount of force, right? Once that arrow leaves, that is the most that it's ever going to have. It's going to be degrading as it flies. It's going to be degrading as it encounters resistance. So what that then means is the more effort that it takes to traverse that blade, the less work or penetration that is going to happen. And that's where like blade count really starts adding up. Because if you have, if it's 3 inches long, like Doc was saying, if it's 3 inches long and 1 inch wide, then it's a 1/2 inch blade. So it's 3 divided by 1/2 is 6. There's 2 blades. It's a 3 mechanical advantage. You add an extra blade. Well, now it's 6 divided by 3 blades. So now we're at a 2. Yeah. And, you go to 4, even though the shape stays the same, you're adding more resistance with each of those blades. And Doc, you can chime in here, but the 3-to-1 was essentially the point where you were losing structural integrity anywhere beyond that, right?
Yeah, that's essentially where it becomes very difficult to keep the broadhead from bending.
And so that's really the kind of, limit is the more efficient you make it, the longer and narrower that the tip gets, the less durable it is. And so like even your near 3-to-1 heads, you really want to start looking at material. You want to start looking at how, the hardness, and if there's concerns with it being brittle, or if it's not hard enough, is that tip just going to curl. So there's a lot of little nuances that can play into this one, but the core of it is just more efficient. Yeah. And it's honestly, this is one of the factors that anyone can swap out to a different broadhead, not change a single other thing. They can keep the same weight. They can keep everything else the same. But if you go from a broadhead that, I mean, like the stuff that you were using before you made your switch was around like a 0.5.
Yikes.
Right? So you were right off the bat, you were having your potential. And then you went to the Samurai initially, didn't you? Or
Masai.
no? Masai.
I bought the Samurais when I went out west for elk.
Yeah. But like, I guess the Samurai is a really easy example. It's a triangular, style blade.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that one's at like a 2.3 or 2.4. But you think about the potential gain there, going from a 0.5 to something just over 2.
Yeah.
That's an 8 times difference.
That's huge.
4 times. It's been a long day. But I mean, that's substantial, right?
Yeah.
And that's not taking into account any of the other factors. That's just going, instead of having what force and the amount of work that you can do, you're going to double it and then double it again, because maybe half to 1 to 2, right?
Right.
I mean, you could just look at, the first few deer I took, I was shooting, fixed blades, fixed heads, thunderheads, muzzies. I had pass-throughs those first few deer. And then I switched to mechanicals. And then, I should have thought of it sooner. Like, I changed my broadhead and I stopped getting my pass-throughs. But hey, I was getting those big holes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not quite a trade-off that I would be willing to make anymore.
Right. Well, and I don't think, to that point, like, I don't think people realize how significant the differences in penetration can be with, like, surely changing your broadhead shouldn't change that much. You know what I mean? Like, when you just look at it on a surface level, you wouldn't think. It's kind of like the FOC, like we were talking about taking weight off the back end. Like, it doesn't seem like you're shooting the same grain.
Yeah. It seems inconsequential.
Right. But it's actually very, so I think that also lends to, like, people, myself particularly, like, I underestimate how much each one of these factors actually plays a huge role in penetration. Like, because a lot of the stuff, if you just look at it, you would think, that can't make that big of a difference. And it's like, actually, it makes a huge difference. So,
well, one of the things with the mechanical heads is at impact, it has to open.
Right.
So it takes a lot of your energy that could be used during that pass through up to open that broadhead.
Right.
And then when that happens, it also creates like a bigger, impact on the animal. So it generates their adrenaline a lot quicker, if that makes sense.
Well, and that's a fun piece to touch on for mechanical advantage, because I don't know how many times I've had comments like this, but folks are so used to, like, the big kick. Right. You shoot a deer. What do?
Yeehaw.
Big kick and it's off to the races, right? When you have a truly efficient arrow and you make a clean hit, it's not uncommon for them to barely react.
So example, last year, I shot my buck. I was like 500 grain build, mid 20s FOC. I was using a Masai, I believe. I shot the buck, and he didn't really do anything. He just kind of trotted off, and he's standing there, and I'm like about to throw my bow out of the tree. I'm like, I just missed
Yeah.
him. I just missed him. And then all of a sudden he starts wobbling and he falls over.
Yeah.
And I'm like, he just didn't know that he got hit. I was a double lung shot. I mean, I busted a rib on impact and busted a rib on the pass through coming out. And I thought I missed him. And no, he just never knew he was hit.
And that so often it's like you get a twitch and a little like, what was that? And then, on kind of high alert, but just kind of assessing.
Yeah.
And it's, compared to some of the big, wide, flatter cutting heads, the best thing that I can attribute it to is the felt impact, right? One's like a slap and the other is, just smooth.
Right.
And even if you have the exact same shot, right? Say you make impact and that deer or that animal is going to be dead in 10 seconds, right? What's the difference in distance between a walking animal for 10 seconds and one at a full sprint?
3/4 of a mile or more.
Right. It's like they can cover some distance, right? I mean, even
they teleport.
Like elk.
Well, I mean,
how much ground can they cover?
That buck I shot, like 3 years ago now, was a heart shot, and I shot him, and I mean, he expired within 60 yards from point of impact, and until you were real close to the buck, there wasn't really a blood trail. But again, didn't need one. I watched him die, and he expired in seconds. My dad made a similar shot like a week later using a lighter arrow build with a 2-blade mech head, and his buck went like 150 yards or something like that. But man, his blood trail was, you could run on it, he would tell me. And I'm like, Dad, that deer don't run.
Right.
No, my deer doesn't run because, that right there just shows like him using a mech head, very similar shot. His went how far compared to mine?
Yeah.
I mean, it went twice the distance, if not more.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's just one of those kind of ancillary benefits that people don't think about is on top of the penetration gains that you can get from an efficient broadhead.
Yeah.
That tends to be shorter trails.
Yeah. Which is ultimately better because 150 yards in the woods is a lot longer than 150 yards. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Yep.
So moving on to number 5, the shaft diameter. So as I read it, obviously a smaller diameter arrow, to quote it, there's a substantial increase in penetration when the shaft of an arrow is at least 5% smaller in diameter than the back of the broadhead's ferrule. That makes sense to me. And maybe I'm skipping ahead. Yeah, I'm skipping ahead to shaft profile, but at what point do you, because we were kind of talking about how, a smaller diameter arrow then to me seems like, are you giving up anything on the overall strength and integrity of that arrow? Like, what are you looking at when we're talking shaft diameter?
Well, you're going to have structural integrity, number one. But in the testing, these are all structurally secure arrows that we're using for the comparisons. And, all cheap, perfect flight, so forth. And what we found when we spread the data out, that if we have that 5% difference, you mentioned the shaft 5% smaller than the ferrule, then we average 10% penetration gain compared to a shaft that was exactly equal in diameter to the ferrule. When the shaft got larger than the ferrule, we averaged a loss of 30% penetration
Wow.
That's a 40% difference in tissue penetration between the shaft that has a favorable ratio, 5% smaller than the ferrule, compared to one that had an unfavorable ratio, anything larger than the ferrule. Now, I think there's a couple of factors that come into play, and I can't prove what they are, but I think this is what's happening. Number one, with the larger shaft, whether it's equal or larger, you're getting increased friction. It's having to force itself down a wound channel, and it has more friction from the wound channel.
Mm-hmm.
The 5% is very interesting because when we went even smaller, it was still just a 10% gain. And I think what's happening is when you get 5% smaller than the ferrule, you've created enough difference that you have a capillary attraction to allow the blood to flow around the shaft. Now, blood, as anybody who's ever tried to skin an animal with bloody hands and a bloody knife knows that blood is a great lubricant.
Yeah.
Fresh blood. And this is also the reason that we do all of our testing within 30 minutes of putting an animal down, because there's still liquid blood in the tissue.
Right.
Cut the tissue with a knife, it will still leak blood. After a period of time, as the blood coagulates, the penetration we can measure goes down with the same arrow setup. So there is a difference in there of the lubrication factor that blood provides. And I think that's the reason that there's no difference between 5% smaller than the ferrule and 10% smaller than the ferrule. As long as it's large enough to allow some blood to get in to lubricate that shaft, then it works just fine. Now, when you've got the larger shaft, not only have you got additional friction, but as anybody knows, if you apply pressure to a wound, it reduces blood flow.
Right.
This larger shaft is providing pressure on the cut tissue, and it's reducing the blood flow. A big takeaway from this is you always want to use a shaft that's 5% smaller, at least, than your broadhead ferrule. It's real simple.
Yeah.
And one thing to clarify, I guess, is that this is not indicating, a smaller shaft. It's more on the ferrule side. So you can have a standard diameter shaft and still achieve this as long as your ferrule is 5% larger than the shaft or the component.
Yeah, that was my
Right.
misunderstanding was, so you're not necessarily saying you've got to shoot a micro diameter shaft. You just need to pay attention to the
Ferrule
ratio
size.
between the ferrule and the diameter.
Yep.
Okay.
And so that's where you can have, a lot of like my whitetail setup is a standard diameter arrow. And I still have a favorable transition from the ferrule to the component in the shaft itself. It's easier to achieve it with a smaller shaft, but most of your better than average broadheads have a ferrule that is at least even with a standard shaft.
Mm-hmm.
And just to kind of expand a little bit on one of your questions for durability, it's actually really interesting because the way that tubes work, you have to almost think about it like PSI, pressure, per square inch. Because as you go from like a standard shaft to small diameter 204 to like a micro 165, you're reducing the surface area And so now any load that's applied when that shaft flexes, the pressure is moving around the actual tube.
Mm-hmm.
And so then you can essentially get like a hot spot where on the opposite side of where the force is coming from. And the less surface area that you have to distribute that force, the more risks there is for failure.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's ways of countering it, but it's like, I guess my initial background on this was like roll cages. You don't increase the wall thickness to get a stronger cage. You increase the tube size.
Mm-hmm.
And part of it is because the structural benefits of the larger tube and having more surface area, you get a lot more bang for your buck compared to the weight that you're getting in a heavier wall.
Yeah.
And that directly plays into looking at your arrows, because you can have a smaller diameter shaft, you can increase the wall thickness, but now you've got a really heavy shaft.
Right.
Now you've got less FOC. So it's one where, okay, like you need to get the structural integrity, but for what purpose are you negatively impacting other areas?
Right.
Because as long as it's smaller than the ferrule, then you're good.
Yeah.
Like there isn't much of a benefit aside from, potentially like crosswind type stuff, downrange to the shaft size.
So the next one is one that number 6 is arrow mass. This is one I've heard people, because there's, the argument that some people don't think FOC matters. However, they do agree that a heavier arrow is beneficial. So this is one that I'm curious to because it can kind of get muddy, because you're talking total arrow weight. Yeah. If you just want to get into arrow mass and kind of explain why that's still important, but then also why it's important to also include the FOC element, because like I said, I've heard it both ways, where don't worry about your FOC as long as your total arrow weight is higher. So where does this one come into play?
The FOC is going to give you the increase in penetration, regardless of the arrow mass, relative to what you would have without that FOC.
Mm-hmm.
So that FOC increase is going to work on every arrow. So you're going to get, with greater arrow mass, you're going to get an increase in penetration. But you put FOC on top of it, just like we were talking about in compounds.
Mm-hmm.
The amount of percentage increase you would get from that given amount of FOC is going to apply to the greater penetration you're already getting because of the heavier arrow, the greater arrow mass.
Mm-hmm.
The greater arrow mass just increases the efficiency of your bow. The arrow being heavier is in contact with the bowstring longer, which gives it more time to absorb energy from the bow. That's why you have less noise and less vibration, less hand shock with a heavier arrow than you do with a lighter arrow, because the arrow is taking more of the bow's stored energy and putting into useful force in the form of the forward momentum of that arrow, useful force for our purposes, penetrating the arrow. So when all else is equal between arrows, just identical, except for the weight, the tissue penetration is roughly proportional to the momentum. In other words, you can use momentum as a rough guide to how much penetration you're going to get.
Mhm.
You cannot use kinetic energy for that. Kinetic energy is how hard it hit. It has nothing to do with the forward motion. It doesn't have a direction. Momentum has a direction.
Right.
So it is a directional force. Now, neither one is a perfect predictor of penetration, but momentum is a whole lot closer than kinetic energy, which really doesn't show the correlation.
Yeah.
Now, don't confuse this to mean that two different eras will penetrate equally because they have equal momentum. This is why it's got to be roughly proportional, not more precisely. How much of the era's momentum comes from its mass or its weight, and how much comes from the velocity is a factor, as is the efficiency of your broadhead, its mechanical advantage. Momentum is a property of the air. It belongs to the air. It's carried with the air. And it is derived strictly from the air's forward motion and its mass. As the arrow slows down during penetration, the velocity is shed. But the mass always remains constant.
Right.
So the heavier the arrow at a given amount of momentum, the longer it's going to be able to push forward. So at equal impact force, the heavier it is, the longer it takes to stop. The result is deeper penetration. Now, the fast arrow guys all come up with the thing, but the faster arrow travels further in the same time. Well, they're forgetting one thing. As the velocity increases, the resistance increases by exponential amount.
Yeah.
In other words, if you double the force, then the resistance of the tissue to penetration increases by a factor of 4. If you triple the velocity of the air, the tissue resistance increases by a factor of 9. It's 9 times as great. That's what they overlook when they're saying, well, it's faster. It's just going to travel further than the same distance. No, it's going to need more resistance.
Yeah.
And people overlook that resistance difference. And, it's one of those things that they should stop sometime and ask themselves why fish hairs are solid fiberglass, weigh 2,000 grains.
Yeah.
Water has a lot more resistance than air. So you shoot a lighter projectile in there, it slows down faster. That heavier weight is going to allow it to penetrate in whatever medium it is, no matter how deep, dense that medium is.
Yeah.
Now, you should logically use the greatest error mass that acceptable trajectory allows. And that's up to the hunter and what he's trying to accomplish. But some things to remember, it doesn't do any good to just hit the animal. You've got to penetrate the tissues for it to be lethal.
That's the
You
big
get all
one.
the guys that like to hunt out west now and say, well, I need to be able to shoot my elk at 80 yards. Well, I've got one simple answer for them, and they won't like it. I never had to shoot an elk that far because I was a better hunter than that.
Yeah.
If I can't get close enough to shoot him, that's my fault.
Right.
That's my shortcoming as a hunter. It's not anything to do with the arrow. But when I hit him, I'm going to kill him.
Right.
But I've got the arrow that is designed for terminal performance. It's like trying to shoot an elk with a varmint bullet.
Yeah.
If that bullet blows up on impact, it's not going to kill the animal. Or if it blows up on the ribs, it's not going to kill the animal. anything works sometimes. And there are a lot of elk killed with light arrows. And there are a lot of elk that never recovered from shot with light arrows.
Yeah.
So, there is a trade-off in of what you need to be able to do. It's just like with every other penetration maximizing factor. You put those all in place and you're going to get improved arrow performance. But you increase your arrow mass, all these factors in there, you're going to end up with a better penetrating arrow because you have more usable force.
Yeah.
This gives you more outcome penetration. Take it away, Rob.
And that's the other part of it is like, I mean, like you said, if we're looking at a single bow, your kinetic energy is set, right? Your draw length is what it is. You're shooting whatever poundage you're shooting. Your kinetic energy is essentially locked in place at that point. So that really doesn't do us much good. The momentum, as you change your arrow mass, is going to give you some feedback and show how that force is changing, right? But the background piece is that inertia is directly tied to mass. And the more mass you have, the more inertia you'll have. So now on top of the like speed related resistance that we were just talking about, the heavier that your arrow gets, the more it's going to try and sustain itself. And the easiest visual for this is a sight tape or your pin gaps. So often your really light arrows, they start off nice and flat, right? But if you've got 10-yard gaps, it's every pin or every spot in your tape, it just keeps spreading, right? It's dropping at a faster and faster rate,
right?
The further downrange it gets. That doesn't happen nearly as much when you start getting mass. And that's like my big game setup was like 950 grains. And I have nearly the same gap from 20 to 30 yards that I do from 90 to 100 yards.
That's insane.
And the fun thing for me is that it makes it extremely easy to adjust on the fly. Because I don't have to think about like, oh, my pin's at 30. It walked to maybe 35. How big is my gap from 30 to 40?
Right.
I guess I have a spot hog double pin and then they're triple stack on my two bows. And so I have, points of reference and I can go, okay, I know that is about a 10-yard gap.
Yeah.
I can hold low that same gap. I can bring that pin up that same gap. And I'm confident that I'm in the right area.
Yeah.
So it's one where so many guys get concerned about, well, with these heavy arrows, what if the animal moves? Like I'm going to have to stop and range it again, or I'm going to completely miss.
Yeah.
But it's once you start playing with it, you start recognizing that it's honestly a lot easier to learn the trajectory and to understand your flight path when your arrow weight starts climbing. And, it's not saying that everyone needs to go like a 900 grain arrow, right? But I mean, your 500 grain build, I know that your gaps got more consistent.
Mm-hmm. I was comfortable out to 40 yards at my 550 build.
Yeah.
I was trying to find this part here.
But it's, there's a lot of different pieces to it, but that same, talking about the inertia and how it's helping sustain that speed, which gives you then a more consistent trajectory. Like we said before, an arrow is always flying. And so that same thing applies once we make impact. That same thing applies as it's traversing the animal, as it's exiting. It's going to be holding its speed better and not decaying as much as a lighter arrow would. And that's essentially where you get the additional penetration from, right?
Right. Yeah. And the pin gap thing is especially relevant when a lot of people who are going to listen to this are whitetail hunting. Pretty much that's it. And especially guys who are like, you're waiting for the rut. Well, good luck getting a buck to stand still in the rut.
Right.
That's one thing that I'm not looking forward to this season. Last year I shot an Easy V sight, and I don't know if you guys have experience with that sight, but I really enjoy it. And I found it, for anyone who's listening, who's heard of it and like, there's no way that works. It does. When you get it matched up to the speed of your arrow properly, that self-ranging sight is awesome. And then I shot 3D all summer, so I went and got myself a Fast Eddie double pin as well. And because I spent like $300 on it, I'm like, damn it, you're hunting with that this year, but it's one thing to, kind of pre-range things, kind of understand where everything should be. But I am not looking forward. Like, I don't know until it happens. I'm not looking forward to trying to like range an animal and figure it out. And that's where, when you're watching the thing move, where you're talking about pin gap, not having to mess around with range it, try to move it, range it, try to move it. You should already kind of understand, like you said, where everything should fall in line.
And that's one thing, like so many people don't practice that.
Well, yeah. Right. And so that's kind of what I've been waiting to say too.
Yeah, go for it.
Shooting a heavier arrow is not going to negatively affect a proficient archer.
Right.
As long as you're out there and you're practicing, which if you are going to be hunting, you should be practicing, you will know your whole system outside of the arrow. I mean, you will know how your bow works with your arrow build. You're going to know. When I first started hunting, my dad gave me one pin and one pin only. It was a fixed pin sight. I had one pin at 20 yards.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to learn to aim higher or lower depending where my target was.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where Rob was going, is people don't practice that. They don't get that in their heads. They're
right.
just they're so reliant on, the technology that has come out in the last, few decades, that they're just complacent. They don't.
Well, so much of the practice is like, weekend 3D tournaments or 3D leagues,
mm-hmm.
where every shot you're ranging,
right,
picking your pin or moving your dial and taking your shot right on the pin. But like, how often do you go out and practice where, okay, I'll set a target up and I'll take a tennis ball and just throw it over my shoulder and go shoot from that spot.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll have like a marker to I go, okay, I know I normally shoot from here. That's 20 yards. So I have my point of reference for wherever I'm kind of starting from. But even doing walkbacks to learn your trajectory have your pin locked and shoot 5 yards, shoot 10, shoot 15, keep going, learn where that arrow is going to impact at different distances.
Right.
And when you start doing that, now you get a whole lot more comfortable of making those on the fly calculations of, like, especially in the whitetail woods. If you're, hitting a spot for the first time, the first thing that I do once I'm up in a tree is I start picking out markers. I go, okay, that tree is at 10, that's at 25, that weird clump of grass over there is at 15. And I'll have kind of an entire arc in my, my range that I can shoot.
Right.
With known distances, to the point where realistically, as long as it comes into that, semicircle, I don't even need to pull my rangefinder out.
Right.
Because I know that it just walked past that tree. That's at 25. It's halfway between that and whatever this is. That's at 15. Yeah, it's about a 20-yard shot. And that gets even more important when, like, we did the same thing out west. Like, if you get into a spot, or even if you're stalking, if you have a moment, range a couple of different targets.
Yeah.
Because now, at least, if I'm at 40 right now, the animal is there. It's, that tree's at 50. This one's at 35. So now, even if I start moving, if the animal moves, I have an indication of how far it potentially moved.
Yeah.
And as long as you're, putting all those pieces together, then you have a pretty good picture of what it is. And it's the other kind of piece of this that Doc touched on that I want to hit on again, with shooting as heavy as you're comfortable. One, that comfort is knowledge. You can become comfortable at any arrow speed if you practice it and you learn it. So what you're comfortable with today might be 500 grains, but that's based off of wherever you started, right? So once 500 is your new normal, now 550 won't seem as bad.
Yeah.
And now 600 won't seem that bad. And the further that you go, the less of an impact it has.
It's really not that scary. I mean,
No,
I jumped from a sub 400 grain arrow to 525 grains, and literally,
and that's you were at like
42 pounds. And all I did was just go back out, find my 10 yard, find my 20 yard, and just you practice. It didn't change anything really for me, because if you're hunting in the hardwoods, most of your shots are, I would argue, 20
inside of 25 for sure.
But yeah, like at 550, I was comfortable up to 40 if all conditions are right. But a wise man once told me, don't tell me how far your shot was, tell me how close you got to the animal.
Yeah. And that's one with the trajectory thing. Like, on our last podcast we did together, we talked about that, shoot what you're comfortable with. And I was thinking about that, and I don't know maybe it's just like lack of experience doing it, but because I shoot a heavier arrow, to me, I don't understand the fear of trajectory. I don't know if maybe it's people just assume that when there's more of an arc to the arrow, it's less accurate. I don't know if that's what the brain thinks is, well, if it starts, making that rainbow shape, there's no way it can be accurate, which is not true.
Yeah.
But, when you talk about shoot what you're comfortable with, it's like you said, your comfortability factor is just a matter of shooting the damn arrow.
Exactly.
And you come to realize like, oh, especially when, you're inside of 20, 30 yards for a deer, which is really all you should ever really need to shoot. You're not ever going to have that rainbow arc to it.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe if you're trying to shoot a 1500 grain arrow at 130 yards, you might have something, but from a hunting scenario, it's not something to be afraid of.
Yeah.
So
I think so much of it is honestly with like 3D is I can fully understand wanting lighter arrows for competitive purposes.
Mm-hmm.
And like, that's not a game of penetration. That's a game of catching lines.
Right.
And so if I misjudge a little or whatever the case is, I want the greatest chance of catching that line. And I think too many people translate that like internally as accuracy.
Yeah.
And it's not. It's in the woods, whether or not you catch that line isn't the end all be all. Like, being off an eighth of an inch doesn't mean that the deer's not dead.
Right.
And like we just were talking about, if you're out there, you should have a fairly good idea of what the distances are. And that was like Troy did the Project Dick a couple years ago, little kid's bow that he was shooting like 1,000 grain arrows out of. And it was to prove the point that, like, especially like Texas, you're working out around feeders. It's a known distance.
Yeah.
Where in that scenario is there any concern for trajectory? The pin is the pin.
Right.
So there's a lot of mental, aspects to it.
Yeah. But I mean, that also, not to say like, if you do feel uncomfortable with trajectory and you can't get past it, I think that's the point of like, shoot what you're confident in. And as you know, with archery, your mental state and your confidence only comes with practicing. So moving on to number 7, blade edge finish. This is a fun one because you see every broadhead ever marketed is, well, unless the heavier arrows tend to be pretty upfront of like, you're going to need to sharpen this one, but you're off the shelf. They're always hunt ready, razor sharp, blah, 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 blah. And a lot of times they're not. They may seem sharp to the naked eye, maybe when you first take them out, you can kind of catch a couple hairs off with it. I know when I shot mechanicals the first year I ever shot or I ever hunted, they weren't even shaving sharp. But to me, I was like, well, they look like razor blades, and I went and hunted with them anyway. So let's dig into the importance of blade edge finish and making sure, I think, better understanding what the term sharp really does mean in terms of a broadhead.
Really, the best edge you can have is going to be the thinnest, smoothest, sharpest edge you could possibly get. Now, whether you can get the thin or not, whether it's a double bevel, it doesn't matter. You must at least have a smooth, beard shaving sharp honed and strop edge. When we're doing the testing on this, I took 7 thicknesses of fresh buffalo hide. And that's probably close to 8 inches of some of the most tough fibrous hide you'll ever see. And it weighed enough, you had to pull it up. I had to hang it up off a steel bar. We had to pull it up with the truck.
Jeez.
What we did was take a whole series of arrows and with different broadheads. Now, all of them had other factors in there, the shaft smaller, all the things like that. But we took each of the broadheads, some with 3 blades, some 4 blades, some 2 blades, and we shot them into the hide. Now, we did it with each one of them sharpened a different blade. So we would do a honed and strop edge, and we would do a file sharpened edge, smoothly file sharpened edge, and then we would do the hill type serrated edges, where you reverse the file and drag it down the blade on the edge and put visible serrations on the edge. And we took each arrow and compared it back to itself, sharpen the different methods. We're looking strictly at penetration. And in every case, regardless of the broadhead type, shape, number, blades, the honed and stropped edge showed a 26% average penetration advantage over a file sharpened edge and a 60% penetration advantage over the hill type serrations. But there's a lot more to having a good edge finish than just the penetration. So when we get down to what's going to kill the animal, the loss of blood, we have to look at the clotting cascade. And this is basically how the blood clots, coagulates, stops the bleeding. It's initiated by the disruption of the cells that line the inner portion of the cell. It's the inner lining of, not the cell, of the vessel. So it's the inner lining of all the blood vessels, right on down to capillary size. When you disturb these cells, when you disrupt one, it releases a protein called prothrombin. Prothrombin is then going to react with the blood plasma to form an enzyme called thrombin. Thrombin catalyzes the conversion of fibrinogen in the blood into fibrin. The fibrin is going to attach itself to tissue tags at the edge of the cut, then seal the vessel off to reduce or stop the image. Now, the smoother edge you have and the sharper edge you have, and importantly, the thinner edge you have, is going to disrupt fewer of those cells in the inner lining of the vessel. That's what's going to reduce the amount of prothrombin that's produced. Less prothrombin, less thrombin. Less thrombin, less fibrinogen. Less fibrinogen, less fibrin. Harder for the clot to form.
Yeah.
But but there's a lot more to it than just that. That smoother edge, sharper edge, is going to create fewer tissue tags as it cuts the vessel. So you have fewer places for the fibrin to attach. So not only do you have less fibrin produced, you have fewer places for it to attach to the cut to try to seal off the bleeding. And of course, We don't want to seal off the bleed. We want it to bleed as long as it can.
Right.
And another thing about edges, and an edge bevel itself has a mechanical advantage, just like a broadhead does. So the lower the slope, the higher mechanical advantage, and the more work that cutting edge can do. Now, the big advantage here means that if you took a single bevel, sharpened at 25 degrees on one side, 0 on the other, you have a 25-degree angle. Your typical double bevel is sharpened at 25 on both sides, or a 50-degree angle.
Mm-hmm.
A much slower, half as much mechanical advantage. Having a higher mechanical advantage on the edge at equal sharpness, equal smoothness, means that thinner edge with a higher mechanical advantage can cut the blood vessel with half the force applied between the cutting edge and the blood vessel. So it essentially cuts the blood vessel twice as easy. So that's the reason for the thin part of it. But of course, it's got to be structurally intact. You have to have the steel good enough to hold that thin edge without it rolling when it hits the bone, things like that. So it's important to have the structural integrity of the edge of the broadhead, which is why in our testing now, we measure pre and post shot sharpness with a modified best sharpening instrument that Ron Schwartz at TME built for us. And it gives you an idea of the edge retaining quality of the various broadheads that we're testing.
Now, do you have you found a specific angle? I know some broadheads come in, 25, and some are at like a 30 or 35 degree angle. Obviously you did speak to the mechanical advantage of it, but does when all, let's just say all steel is the steel you're using, or the hardness is created equal, that 25 then would give you the higher mechanical advantage.
That
correct?
would give you the higher mechanical advantage. And of course, you got some out there now with a 20-degree bevel.
Mm-hmm.
So for more testing, they have done quite well. Though I haven't seen all the figures off of this year's testing. So we'll see how they did this time around. But the thinner you can get it and still maintain integrity of the edge, your penetration, the better off you are.
And so your lower quality steel, not necessarily low quality in terms of like off the shelf, but you can buy, when I'm looking at buying my 2-blade single bevels, you can buy different grades of steel. You would then probably need a higher degree, which would give you less mechanical advantage, but possibly less roll on the finish.
Well, I will just throw out a teaser here. Wait for Rob to put out this year's report.
Yeah.
There's some interesting things that occurred regarding edge bevel and the steels used.
Yeah.
So there will be some interesting information coming out of this year's report on that. And it was kind of surprising.
Oh, yeah. That's one thing, I guess, kind of on that note is, depending on the material used, your desired angle will likely change, right? So some materials you can get harder and it remains structurally sound, doesn't get brittle. And so then it can support a thinner edge. other material would be brittle and start chipping, chunking off. And so then you need more material, more support for that edge. And then you have a higher bevel angle, right?
Right.
There is no like hard and fast, do this.
Yeah.
That's where it's kind of tough with that one, because it's like Doc mentioned, there are some that seem to be doing well now down close to 20. There's others that I know struggle even at 30.
Yeah.
And it's there's a lot that goes into that, even to the point of you could have the same material, the same finished hardness, but how that hardness was achieved and what that tempering process looked like can give you a different result. So it's can be a little tricky, but for the most part, I mean, the majority of stuff that I use and sharpen, I'm typically somewhere in the upper 20s, 25 to like 28. And that's just years of sharpening stuff. And if I get some chatter on a certain head, I'll bump it up a little bit the next time that I clean it up. But there is no like hard and fast rule on it, unfortunately.
Yeah, I was just kind of curious because, you can, when you go and you look on broadheads, depending on the type of, you might be able to buy the same broadhead, but they may make it in different types of steel, and one can be considerably more expensive than the other. Mm-hmm. So if you're looking to shoot a 2-blade single bevel, I'll just throw out cutthroats. I've shot cutthroats, and you can buy, I think it's like S7 tool steel or whatever, and then you can just get like standard. So that's why I was saying, if you didn't want to spend the extra, I don't remember how much it is. It's not that much different, but if you didn't want to buy the top premium steel, would you benefit from keeping an angle when you do go to actually sharpen it yourself? If you're just buying that standard steel, would you be safer to stay around the 30 area instead of trying to take that angle down even further? Because with that less quality steel, do you have a higher percentage chance that is going to end up rolling over on you?
Well, and that's where it's tough, because like in that situation, the standard is high carbon steel, mm-hmm. which has benefits over tool steel.
Yeah.
That's mainly its shock resistance, right? High carbon steel does really well with impacts and not chattering or chipping. And it's more likely to roll. There's some balance there depending on what you want. Like, it's honestly, I don't have much of a problem with a decent high carbon. Only real downside is that it rusts. Mm-hmm. But that's where I will say that you don't want to get excessive on the safety side of it, right? There's some heads that are at like 40 degrees, and it's nearly impossible to truly get them sharp because of how thick the edge is. And there can be some other challenges that come along with that. So, I mean, for most stuff, staying around 30% is, I would say, a safe bet.
One other thing I'd throw in there is people always talk about how sharp can you get a broadhead. Ron Sports and I played with that a while back, several years ago now. And we were both able to get a broadhead sharp enough to cut curls off of a single hair.
Jeez.
That's a sharp broadhead.
Oh, yeah.
How long does it even take you to sharpen that? That's got to take some time. Like I remember when I first sharpened.
It takes a lot of technique.
Yeah. I guess. Yeah. I was gonna say where first time I sharpened my cutthroat, I made it way worse. Like I ruined one of my broadhead. The first one I ever started like learning how to sharpen them, I ruined it completely.
That's not unusual.
It can be tough. Once you understand what you're doing, it realistically doesn't take that long.
Yeah.
Especially like anytime that I buy new broadheads, I go through and I essentially clean them up. So in the machining process or their grind process, depending on how they sharpen, a lot of heads will have like a cup to the bevel. Like if it's sharpened on a wheel or something. And so knowing how I sharpen with stones, flat stones, I go through and I clean up the bevels to get them flat and consistent and where I want it from a sharpness standpoint. And then down the road, it's very quick to touch them back up and get them to where I want. Mm-hmm. That initial cleanup can be more intensive. But as long as they're in a known state and they're at a known angle, then it's set, match the angle. And all you have to do is get the smallest little curl on the back, not visible, like rub your finger on it. There should just feel just the smallest burr. And at that point, that you've got to the edge. Mm-hmm. Strip it off. You're good.
Yeah.
That's a lot of people go excessive with that burr. And all it's doing is removing unnecessary material and making it harder to strip that burr off to actually get your, flat backside and get it sharp.
That's exactly what I did too, because it was like I ran it through a few times, felt a little burr, and I was like, all right, let's get a big burr. And yeah, I bet you I took 100 grains off that broadhead. Like I looked at it when I was done compared to the ones that came. It was a cutthroat, and I was like, this is like a 45 grain head now. Hey, it had higher mechanical advantage, right?
Yeah.
So moving on to number 8, shaft profile. This is one that I still like when you're talking tapered shafts. Where do you even get those? I've never even seen that marketed. Like if I'm understanding it correctly, you're talking one end of the shaft is basically wider and it tapers down towards the tail. I've never even seen that.
So there are a few companies that offered, different types of tapered shafts. Grizzly Stick is probably the most well-known at this point. Aerodynamics has some. Easton has their T64 taper, which is a partial taper. It's essentially two size shafts blended together. So you have like a larger section up front and then a section of taper and then a smaller shaft. Mm-hmm. Whereas like the Grizzly Stick shafts are a true full continuous taper. So those are a continuous 204 internal diameter. So the ID stays the same all the way through. And the wall thickness is, I believe it's 1,000th per inch taper. So over the course of a 30-inch shaft, you have 30 thousandths difference in diameter.
And now what does that do when you then talk about spine? Does that change I'm not that you can't buy it the correct way, but what actually changes when you then have a taper to that shaft?
So,
am I going to shoot in theory, higher spine then?
No. That's because essentially there is no typical static spine number for a tapered shaft because every inch is going to be different.
Right.
So then you're looking at more of an average. And so they have them rated accordingly to align with, other shafts with the same number. Right. But the fun part is that on a true taper, you have a heavier wall up front, which is both increasing your FOC and it's stiffer.
Yeah, that's what I was kind of getting to.
And so now where all of the impact is, where all of the stress and everything is at the front. And so now you've got heavier walls, stiffer shaft, and that's exactly what you want where all the impact occurs, right? And then the tail, where there really is no stress, is thinner and lighter.
Mm-hmm. It seems like that would be beneficial. It's obviously beneficial, but I'm surprised that a tapered shaft isn't more mainstream with,
it's a cost thing.
Is it?
It's challenging, to say the least, to make a true tapered shaft.
Yeah.
And there's various ways of doing it, but one of the ways is to grind the taper in. So that means that you're essentially building two arrows. One is your finished arrow and the other is powder on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
So you've got double the material costs. You've got significantly more effort to make the shaft. And there's a much higher chance of quality concerns where you're scrapping everything out.
Right.
So the cost is reflective of that, but there's definite benefits to it. I know, yes, I'm hopeful that a few other companies will be bringing something to the market in the near future here. I think we might see a new tapered at some point.
Now, does tapering, aside from the advantages you just mentioned, is there any other reason that, or any other benefits that come out of that? Like I could see from a maybe traveling through the animal perspective, I assume it creates less drag.
Yeah, Doc, do you want to run through that?
It does create less drag as it penetrates, and we're testing them now. These are arrow setups that match in weight, shaft material, so forth.
Right.
Same broadhead, same bow, multiple shots. A tapered shaft gives you 8% penetration gain over a parallel shaft. And we test against barrel tapered shafts too, which you've probably never heard of either. but there's a
No, I haven't.
50% gain over a barrel taper shaft. So, of course, parallel shaft is about a 7% gain over barrel taper. You don't see barrel taper shafts very often, except traditional shooters. You can get wood barrel taper shafts, and of course, taper shafts. You said you've never heard of them. Virtually every primitive arrow ever made was a taper shaft because it was made from shoots of trees or bamboo or something that has nature's already built a taper in.
Right.
So they've been around a long time. Now, for most things, and I would imagine that 98% of the people shooting an arrow that's built off the factors are shooting at the most 11 factors. This is the factor that's most often left out. And it is because of the cost of making, modern material taper shafts. So you are giving up a slight amount of penetration. The people that really would benefit most out of the taper shafts, and where I'd recommend that people tend to use them, are for those that are hunting the very, very biggest game, those that have very low poundage bows and or very short draw lengths, where every little bit of penetration gain you can get becomes important.
Moving to number 9, broadhead and arrow profile. Yeah, go ahead and explain that. I have my thought on it, but obviously you can introduce that better than I can.
Well, basically all it's saying is that any kind of rough or irregular surface is going to create drag in every tissue it penetrates through. Also create drag in the air, everything, because the air is always flying. Got to remember that. That drag's there regardless. Its effect is most pronounced in what we're interested in during bone penetration. Essentially, the less lumpy and bumpy your arrow and broadhead silhouette is, the more effortlessly it passes through tissues. Now, some additional slickness helps too. That's a whole different topic, but experiment a lot with that, trying to find best lubricants to use. And one thing I will mention on lubricants, a lot of people put chapstick or Vaseline or something like that on their edges to keep them rusty.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Vaseline and chapstick are both coagulants. They tend to promote blood stoppage, bleeding.
Right.
And they're the last thing you want to use. And I used to keep paper plates in the workshop, lubricated with different stuff, which when I would cut myself, which wasn't all that infrequent, I'd run over there and drop blood on some of them. And then I would measure the coagulation time. And there are actually some lubricants that are anticoagulants that promote bleeding. And the one I ended up using, there's a company in California that imports it. I think it's made in Canada, but you can find them all over Australia, Africa. It was called Inox, I-N-O-X. And it was a very good anticoagulant and an excellent rust preventer. And there'd be some others out there. Of course, there's a lot of new lubricants now, so be a lot of new stuff to test.
Yeah. And I guess that really lends to like when you are looking at like a 2-blade, some of them, like I think, not saying that iron will is bad, but if I remember correctly, that's like a 2-piece. They have the blade and then a ferrule versus like a cutthroat where it's a 1-piece. Would you say that if you can find a 1-piece, that's probably better in this situation because you're going to have a much smoother transition, not such a blunt, an actual ferrule.
Again, you want the mechanical advantage of the ferrule. You want that ferrule to be straight and as long as you can get it out there.
Right.
And fade in just as smooth as possible. Anything that has an abrupt jump up is going to be a problem in bone, particularly.
Yeah.
And even there are broadheads out there, some traditional broadheads, so forth, that are spot welded.
Yeah.
And that actually creates a drag on the bone, particularly ones that have ferrules that are spot welded onto the blade.
So that one, yeah, that's pretty self-explanatory, and that's an easy one to just think about why that would be important and the negative benefits of or the negative consequences of having a big, thick, non-tapered ferrule on there.
Yep.
So number 10, here's a big fight in the broadhead community. Type of edge bevel. Single bevel broadheads are obviously, I think, if I am reading this correctly, are the only ones that actually have a bone splitting effect. Can you, for someone who doesn't quite understand what a single bevel is, can you kind of explain the difference between the single bevel and why there's such a benefit to a single over a double?
A single bevel head, think of the blade. One side of the blade is going to be absolutely straight up and down, flat. The other side is going to have a bevel on it to make your edge. And on the other side of the blade, you're going to have the same thing, but it's going to be on the opposite side. So it creates a rotational effect. The rotation occurs because there is pressure on the bevel from whatever is passing through on one side that is not counteracted by an equal pressure on the other side. So it causes it to rotate. So that's the basic difference. Your typical broadhead has a sharpening bevel on both sides. The single bevel has a sharpening bevel only on one side of the blade. Now, the big advantage with the single bevel is in boneheads. And when we looked at broadheads on arrow setups that were identical, broadheads that were identical in every aspect except the type of edge bevel, the single bevel versions demonstrated a sizable penetration increase in 100% of the cases involving bone impact. Now, when we're doing outcome-driven studies, particularly over a large amount of test shots, to have anything occur with a 100% frequency really jumps out at you.
Absolutely.
And this is the one place in there where we have a 100% frequency. Every single test shot we took showed increased penetration when heavy bone was involved, when we had a single bevel versus a double bevel on absolutely matching arrow setups. Now, the amount of gain in penetration varied a lot by the style of the broadhead. And it ranged anywhere from a 14% gain to a 58% gain. Now, the big gain, 58%, actually occurred on the broadheads that were lower mechanical advantage. So it was a bigger advantage percentage-wise to them than it was the high mechanical advantage broadheads. But don't interpret that to mean they got more penetration overall, because the high mechanical advantage broadheads were getting a huge amount of penetration to start with.
Yeah. And
still they showed a 14% gain, where the others were not getting a lot of penetration. And they showed a big increase in penetration. But it overall still was not as great a penetration as we had out of the high mechanical advantage broadheads.
Mm-hmm.
But all of them showed this increase in penetration in every single case.
So if you were to be shooting a two-blade broadhead, they obviously do come in, like we're saying, single bevel or double bevel. Are there any benefits at all to a double bevel? Because that's the majority of what you're going to find on a broadhead. So why wouldn't you just single bevel it anyway if there's such a clear difference?
Well, it's like I said, it's a stronger edge. So if you have a weaker material, then the double bevel gives you an advantage in the weaker material.
Gotcha.
In other words, a material that will not stand up without rolling or whatever with a single bevel. Then
That
you're
makes
better
sense.
off with a double bevel, because a rolled edge on the single bevel is not going to work. Won't work on a double bevel either. But the double bevel will be more resistant to having a rolled edge.
Gotcha.
So if you're shooting a, shall we say, economy broadhead, you might be better off with a double bevel. But
That makes
single
sense.
bevels, have a lot of other advantages other than just splitting bone. The data was suggesting that they show greater penetration on all soft tissue too, but it wasn't 100% by any means. But a high percentage of them did give an increase in penetration. But some of the other advantages they have are the things we were talking about with the bleeding. They have a thinner edge. They have a higher edge bevel mechanical advantage. So it's going to cut tissue with less force required or less pressure between the tissue and the edge. So that thinner edge, if you just nick a vessel, just barely touch it, it's more likely to cut that vessel. Vessels are tough and they're mobile. As anyone that has ever had IVs put in very often, believe me, I've had hundreds of them or had blood drawn. You know how much blood vessels can move around and how tough they can be to stick something into, even with a sharp needle.
Yeah.
So being able to cut that with the least amount of pressure between the blood vessel and the edge is a high advantage. And of course, we discussed too the rotation through the tissue, the fact that it is cutting a spiral path through the tissue, I guess is the best way to describe it. But the rotation also has some other advantages. Now, if you think about the blood vessels in there, in your body, all the way down to capillaries, they're going gazillion different directions. A rotating head, statistically, will cut more of those vessels on a bias. In other words, not square. Than will a head that penetrates straight through.
Right.
Now, if you think about the size of the opening, take a tube and you cut it off square, look how big the hole is. And then you cut it off at an angle and look how big the hole is, which was going to bleed faster.
Right.
So it gives you an advantage there. You also have the thing we mentioned, the starburst cuts. That occurs in soft tissues and particularly highly mobile tissues. Easiest place to see it is a gut head, where you've got the intestines. A rotating head actually wraps the tissue up around the head, and it will make tiny little nicks and cuts, this truly sharp edge, as much as 5 inches away from the path where the arrow went through.
Jeez.
And we saw this when we were dissecting the animals by taking dye in a syringe and injecting it into the intestines and looking where the holes were.
Yeah.
You only get a brief look because the dye spreads pretty quick. But you can see little nicks and cuts, like I said, up to 5 inches away from where the arrow passed through. So that is a big advantage. And another factor that is hard to rate, if you think about this rotating head through tissue being pushed one direction, so it is compressing tissue on the other side, tensioning the tissue. That's going to increase the tension between the tissue and the sharp cutting edge.
Right.
So that's going to make it easier to cut. It's like cutting a tense rubber band as opposed to one that's just hanging loose.
Yeah.
Much easier to cut. So there are a number of advantages to having that rotating head. There are no downsides. There's no reason not to use a single bevel head.
Yeah.
It has a number of advantages. And as long as you have a material and a broadhead design where it maintains edge structural integrity, there's no reason not to. And like we discussed at the very start, when you have a shot that impacts bone, having a single bevel broadhead or the type of broadhead you've got jumps all the way to the number 4 position, right behind structural integrity, perfect flat, and error mass above the head bone threshold.
Mm-hmm.
So it is very important when you make that bad hit. When the animal votes, oh no, you're not going to shoot me behind the ribs, you're going to shoot me through the shoulder. So there's not a downside to using a single bevel.
I can't even come, there's not even an argument after explaining all that.
Yeah, we never in the study, never had a single large bone split with a double bevel head. We've had bones broken.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big difference from a split. The splits are much larger, much more extensive. But a double bevel head, because it's just pushing straight through, it can shatter the bone, but it cannot split a bone.
I think that's a big misunderstanding out there too. The difference between shattering and splitting bone.
Yep.
That people don't really, they kind of just consider it the same thing.
To shatter a bone than to split a bone.
Yeah.
You can ask any orthopedic surgeon about that.
Yeah. So number 11, tip design, the tanto tip, however you want to say it. You say is most proven effective for a non-skip tip. What are the reasons for that?
The reasons are, of course, I picked that name up and gave it that because I had to have something to call it.
Mm-hmm.
But it reminded me of the tanto tip on a knife, on the tanto knife.
Yep.
If you took 2 of those knives, put them back to back, you would have a tanto tip profile.
Yep.
It comes down to a sharp point, which gives you something that will bite into the bone, but it gives you structural strength. Just like that tanto tip knife is famous for, I remember in the early ads, they would show people driving through the hoods of cars. That's back when cars were made out of real good steel.
Right.
Or you could stand on the hood.
Yeah. Not no more.
Not no more. So it gives you a lot of strength in there, but it has that ability to bite in and not want to skid off.
Mm-hmm.
When we looked at tip profiles, we used, again, matching arrow setups, except matching broadheads, except for the tip design. We did 7 different tip designs. And when we looked at the penetration on bone heads, the tanto tip with 110% more penetration than the worst performer tested, and 27.5% more penetration than the second best performer. Now, one of the big problems was the tendency, because bones are curved, not many flat bones in the body,
right,
that you can get absolutely perpendicular, or the tendency of a broadhead to skip off the bone. Now, for one thing, that's redirected your arrow now. So you have lost a lot of arrow force.
Yeah.
The tanto tip has the lowest tendency to skid off the bone on angular impacts of everything we tested. Now, a needle tip, a true needle tip, which just came down straight bevel to the finest tip you could get, might do as well if you could ever have one strong enough that it wouldn't damage.
Right.
We never found one that maintained structural integrity.
So,
no tip overall cannot be beat as an all-around point. It has the strength and it tends to bite into the bone well.
Yeah, I can imagine if now that thinking about it, because initially, you think like you were calling a needle tip, you would think that would just be, why wouldn't that would hit the bone and skip right, or not skip at all? It would go right in. But yeah, I bet that has a high tendency to curl.
It curls and breaks.
Yeah.
The ones that had high quality steel like that broke.
Yeah.
Just not enough material there to maintain integrity.
Yeah.
And the soft ones bend. And if it's got to do one or the other, breaking is better than bending.
Yeah. All right. So we're finally at number 12, arrow mass above heavy bone threshold. I think this is the one thing, if there was any factor that most people are aware of, I think this is the one factor that gets everybody into the big heavy light arrow fight, because
it is the most misunderstood and most misquoted
yeah
of all the factors.
Yeah, everyone wants to think that this factor is saying that Dr. Ashby says if it's not above 650, the whole thing is a bust. So let's hear it straight from you. What this factor really means and what is it really saying?
The 650 just came straight out of the testing. And what we found was that at or very, very near 650 grains, every broadhead tested showed a marked increase in the frequency of penetrating heavy bone when the weight was at that level. Now, if you've got a broadhead that forms poorly on bone, that increase may be very small. If he's below threshold, say a 600 grain arrow, might show up 8% frequency of breaking heavy bone below that threshold. And above the threshold, that would jump to 12 or 15%. On your better quality, higher mechanical advantage broadheads, a lot of those were around 50% when you were up at 550, 575, 600 grains of breaking the bone. But at 650, those best broadheads jumped to 100% frequency of breaking heavy bone. So it just holds with everything that if you have got that kind of mass, it's going to improve your chances of getting through a heavy bone. That does not say that you cannot ever break a heavy bone with a 400 grain arrow.
Right.
Sometimes it's going to work. Sometimes anything works.
Right.
My favorite story of that is back in the 50s, there was a guy moose hunting in Canada, walking back down a cut road through the woods towards camp. Bull moose stepped out. He reached in his back quiver, pulled out an arrow, shot, dropped in his tracks. Discovered he hit it right in the forehead with a metal blunt. Now that metal blunt killed that moose. But does that make a metal blunt a good arrow to be hunting a moose with?
Right.
But in that particular instant, it worked. So almost anything works if everything's just right. You get an animal with a lot of stress on the bone at a given instant. When the arrow hits, it has a much higher chance of breaking that bone. It's a combination of force on the bone and the force of the arrow hitting the bone.
Yeah.
But it's not going to happen with reliability. And that's where the 650 grain comes in. Now, what we found was that if you had a structurally intact, good broadhead that had a mechanical advantage of 2.6 or greater, we had 100% frequency of reaching heavy bone at 650 grains. This is a way to improve your odds.
Right. And most people just hear 650 and think, well, It's, yeah, like I said, it's either that or it's nothing. And like you said, it's not saying that you couldn't get through, especially like a deer. It's not saying you can't get through a shoulder with less, but to your data, if you want to know for sure that you're going to, this is where you found that threshold to be.
Sure, with a good, a lot of factors involved in it. Arrow set up the slider. Getting through the scapula should be no problem at all.
Yeah.
Scapular reed is more difficult.
Yeah.
Ball joint, I want 650 grains in the broadhead.
Right.
You know, when we're talking about heavy bone, remember those buffalo ribs? Said they're about 0.8 of an inch thick. Well, if you take a northern whitetail, pretty substantial animal, you've got a ball joint that's better than 2 inches in diameter.
Yeah.
That's a lot of bone to go through. So if you happen to hit right there, I want that 650 grain because it will do it, because we've tested it over and over and over. Or, heaven forbid, and it does happen, you hit it with pelvic girdle. 650 and that good broadhead will break down a whitetail pelvic girdle.
Yeah.
Also tested that one, pretty expensive.
Well, that's, yeah. I'm glad you went over that one, because like we said, that's the most contested, argued thing that you hear when people are talking about arrow setups and broadheads and blah blah blah. Everything that goes into it. It always comes back to, well, 650. So I'm glad we explained that.
Yeah, it all goes back to understanding it and understanding bones and how they work. You know, a bone is not only there to support the body, it's there to protect the body.
Right.
So they've got attachments
to
the other bones that allows them to move. And they have some flexion in them. So when your arrow hits, it's got to push that bone to the limit of the movement of those attachments, then push it to the limit of the bone's flexibility before it even begins to penetrate the bone.
Yeah.
And that's why that heavy bone threshold is related to the weight of the arrow. But that heavier arrow, just like we talked about, pushes for a longer period of time. It has a longer time of impulse. So you've got to be able to push on that bone long enough to overcome all of that bone movement and flexion, and then still have enough force left, enough push left to split or break the bone, depending on the type of edge belt you've got.
Right. All right. Well, guys, that is the 12 factors from Dr. Ashby himself. And Dr. Ashby, I'm so thankful for all the time you spent with me on here today and all of the work that you've done that's gone into these 12 factors. And Rob, for the foundation, you guys continuing on with that and, not staying satisfied with, one finding. You're continuing to try to improve every single year and get this information out to the bow hunting community. And like I said earlier, it's extremely important work. And I'm very thankful that you guys are continuing to do that. Like I said, thanks so much for spending so much time with me on here. Rob, remind everybody if they're interested, they want to go back through these 12 factors. They want to know more about Dr. Ashby's findings and the findings that you guys continue to come out with. Where can they find Ashby Bow Hunting Foundation?
So we have our website, has all the reports, has a breakdown of the 12 factors, lots of information on there. That is ashbybowhunting.org. We're also on Facebook and Instagram and LinkedIn. And as we continue moving forward, we're going to be trying to participate in some of the larger conventions, HSC, DSC. As we were at an event earlier this summer at one of the Shields Expos. So trying to get in front of people, and just keep promoting the research and helping people improve.
Yeah. Well, thank you. And I hope you guys do continue doing that. So guys, make sure you go check them out. Support them in any way you can. Because like you guys learned in the episode before, they're not taking money from the industry. They're not, they're relying on bow hunters who want to know more. So support the Ashby Bowhunting Foundation however you can. And guys, make sure you are following us over on Instagram at Antler&FeatherCo. We're on YouTube, Antler&FeatherCo with the & sign, no spaces. You can find us on Facebook as well. Please make sure, if you guys like the show, if you learned something new, if you've found something that you can take into the woods with you after listening, please share, subscribe, follow, rate, and review. When you guys rate and review, that helps us get this information in front of more people, which allows me to continue getting great guests on the show. And that ultimately is going to make you a better, more deadly bow hunter. So I appreciate everyone that's listened this week. Thank you for tuning in, and we will catch you guys next week. This is the Antler&FeatherCo Podcast. You are listening to the Antler&FeatherCo Podcast.